YouTube and TikTok are coming to podcasting. The latest from podnews.net with the Podcast Show, the new international festival for podcasting in London this May. YouTube is offering podcasters up to $50,000 to film their shows and paying podcast networks up to $300,000, according to Bloomberg's Ashley Carman today. And is TikTok getting into podcasting? TikTok's hiring for someone to work in their podcast operation in Sydney in Australia. A successful Australian podcast goes exclusive on Southern Cross Austereo's listener app this week. Two Guys, One Cup got 28,655 downloads in January, according to the Australian Podcast Ranker, but will no longer be available on other platforms from this week. The Podcast Ranker means we can monitor the effect exclusivity has on their figures. The Salem Podcast Network, part of Salem Media Group, made $6.4 million in its first year, according to their figures. It represents 2.3% of the company's revenue. The Shaw Scripts 2021-22 fiction podcast contest winners have been announced. Two winners have been awarded a $5,000 production grant and further $1,000 in cash. 16 months after being recognised, the Parcast Union is still negotiating its first contract with the Spotify-owned company. The company is also said to have rejected a proposal designed to encourage diversity in hiring. AcuSonos is immediately shutting some products and only supporting others until early next year. It's announced in an email. The company makes audio cleanup software and was acquired by Meta last month. Dave Jackson and Jim Collison's Ask the Podcast Host have accused podcast host Podomatic of shady practices. Collison suggests that the company charged a credit card after the card had been removed from their system and refused to refund, in spite of Collison being a customer for more than a decade. Podomatic also only offers 301 redirects for paid customers. Podimo has signed with CAA to identify and create opportunities for its IP. Fresh Produce Media has signed a first-look development and production deal with Audible. And in Spain, Spotify has signed with Prisa Audio to make 3 new original shows. The IAB Tech Lab has said it will not work with Russian or Belarusian companies on technical certification. And host Red ads are the beachfront property of podcasting, according to Marshall Williams, the CEO of Ad Results Media. He's quoted by Edison Research's Tom Webster in a blog post that we link to today from our show notes and our newsletter. In People News, Sam Collins has been hired as NZME's iHeartRadio Content Director. NZME operates iHeartRadio New Zealand. Sam had been with NZME for more than 2 years. He previously worked at Global in London. And Sarah Catron has also been hired as NZME's General Manager of Podcast Commercial and Partnerships. She's worked for NZME for 12 years, most recently as General Manager of Brand Engagement. Time for some tech stuff, and Spooler's dynamic real-time audio publishing system launched last week. According to analysis by John Spurlock, on its first day, Spooler helped the Refresh from Insider to produce 5 editions of their podcast. Podcast Generator, an open-source content management system for podcasting, is currently testing and bug-fixing version 3.2. If you'd like to peek into the Podcasting 2.0 dev meeting from the weekend, you can do that. I've linked to a video of that in our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. In our sample, we've observed Buzzsprout losing 27 podcasts last week and Libsyn losing 14. The podcast hosts gaining the most were, as they always are, Anchor and Megaphone, though Simplecast and Acast also saw a good number of migrations.
Boostagram Corner.
Yes, after we wrote last week about possible ways to remove the email address from RSS feeds and a different method of claiming, Adam Curry sends us a 3,333 sat boost to ask, Spotify requires agreements before ingesting. What's their authentication process? I'm glad you asked, Adam. Well, they send a claim code to the email address in the RSS feed. I've taken a screenshot of that in our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. Dave Jones has also sent us a 1,000 sat boost saying, yay for Boostagram Corner's return. Yay indeed. Use a new podcast app to listen and hit the boost button to send us a message and your support. What's that you say? You don't have a boost button? That's no worries. Go and find one at newpodcastapps.com. And in podcast news, Tony and Ryan is celebrating 5 million downloads in 5 months. The show is hosted by a Melbourne radio DJ and a former radio producer. Wonder how they got together. And is managed by March Media, a radio talent company. Suave won the IDA Documentary Award in the Best Multi-Part Audio Documentary or Series category, say PRX and Futuro Studios, which makes it. The podcast focuses on approximately 2,500 juveniles who've been effectively sentenced to die in prison in the US. On the Media Podcast with Matt Deegan this week, James Cridland, Pod News' editor. That's me. Talks about Acast's acquisition of the Peter Crouch podcast from the BBC and covers more media news. Offline with Jon Favreau will continue as a weekly series in its own podcast feed, Crooked Media has announced. The show sparks thoughtful conversations about what's broken on the internet and what we can do to fix it. And Unique Access Entertainment with Soren Baker is new today from Pantheon Podcasts with 4 episodes focusing on rap music. Host Soren Baker has been covering rap since 1990. This podcast is brought to you by The Podcast Show, the new international festival for podcasting in Islington, in London, this May. It's a 2-day business event with speakers like the CEO of Wondery, Jen Sargent, and Steph Simon from Clubhouse. There's also access to over 120 global brands and unmissable live shows. 20% off day passes are available if you use the code PODNEWS at thepodcastshowlondon.com. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories in full and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.
Here we go for today's number. It's March 7, 2022. 10 balls. Each ball has a number. Numbers 1 through 10. Swirl the numbers. Pick a number. Today's number is 5.
Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Russian and Ukrainian delegations are meeting today for a 3rd time since the Russian invasion was launched 12 days ago. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky warned his people to expect more heavy bombing in cities as he took the international community to task for not doing more to stop Russia's deadly assault.
The audacity of the aggressor is a clear signal to the West that sanctions against Russia are not enough, because they didn't understand, did not feel, they did not see that the world is really determined to stop this war. You will not hide from this reality. You will not hide from new murders in Ukraine.
On Friday, Zelensky addressed U.S. lawmakers pleading for the creation of no-fly zone over Ukraine and harsher sanctions, including a ban on Russian oil and more military aid. The U.S. and NATO have rejected a no-fly zone, citing fears of further escalating the conflict with Russia. The U.S. and NATO are not directly involved in combat operations in Ukraine, but have delivered over 17,000 anti-tank weapons, including Javelin missiles, into Ukraine through bordering nations. The civilian death toll in Ukraine has topped 364, according to the UN, though the true toll could be much higher. Zelensky warned Sunday Russia is preparing to attack the key southwestern port city of Odessa, a city of 1 million. Russian missiles destroyed the international airport in the west-central city of Vinnytsia Sunday. Meanwhile, Human Rights Watch says Russia uses cluster bombs in its assault on Kharkiv last week, which could amount to a war crime. A U.S. official said Sunday Russia had fired 600 missiles since the start of the invasion and has committed 95% of its combat power inside Ukraine. The city of Mariupol is under siege by Russian forces, and attempts to evacuate trapped civilians repeatedly failed over the weekend. Russia said it was creating evacuation corridors for fleeing civilians, but Kyiv slammed the plan for forcing people to leave via Russia or Belarus. Thousands are also fleeing Zaporizhia, where Russian forces are now commanding operations at Europe's largest nuclear plant after seizing it Friday. The number of Ukrainian refugees has now topped 1.5 million. This is a mother who fled to Poland with her children but had to leave her husband behind in Ukraine.
Now I feel safe, but I'm very depressed because my family was divided by war into parts, and I left my heart there in Ukraine.
Meanwhile, a group of prominent global civil rights lawyers filed a complaint with the UN on behalf of African refugees who face racist discrimination from authorities while trying to flee Ukraine. To see our interview with one of those refugees, you can go to democracynow.org. Back in Ukraine, residents of the Russian-occupied southern city of Kherson took to the streets Saturday to protest against Russian forces. Anti-war protests continued as well around the globe and in Russia. A local monitoring group says over 5,000 Russians were arrested by police across 69 Russian cities Sunday, bringing the total number of arrests to 13,000 since the start of the invasion. Meanwhile, Russia's crackdown on the press continues as Moscow passed a new law criminalizing reporting on the war and authorities blocking a number of independent online media outlets. Prominent independent newspaper Novaya Gazeta, whose editor Dmitry Muratov won the Nobel Peace Prize, said it was removing its reporting on the invasion because of censorship, but said it will continue to cover the war's effects on Russian society. Other news outlets, including CNN, ABC, CBS, Bloomberg, and BBC, also moved to limit their activity in Russia. Visa and MasterCard are also suspending operations in Russia. Meanwhile, a growing number of Russians are leaving the country, citing a fear of further crackdowns, including possible martial law and economic instability. In a direct address, the Ukrainian President Zelensky urged Russians to resist Putin's actions in Ukraine and at home.
Мы, украинцы, мы хотим мира.
We Ukrainians want peace. Citizens of Russia, for you, this is a struggle not only for peace in Ukraine. This is a fight for your country, for the best it had, for the freedom that you have seen, for the wealth that you have felt. If you keep silent now, only your poverty will speak for you later, and only repression will answer. Do not be silent.
Russian officials have confirmed the arrest last month of WNBA player Brittany Griner after authorities say they found vape cartridges containing cannabis oil in her luggage at an airport near Moscow. The charges Griner faces can carry a prison sentence of up to 10 years. Griner, who is African-American, is a two-time Olympic gold medalist and a seven-time WNBA All-Star. She's played for a Russian team for the past 7 years. Her wife, Cheryl Griner, said on social media they're fighting for Griner's release and return to the U.S. Over the weekend, the State Department issued a do-not-travel advisory to Russia and warned U.S. nationals the embassy in Moscow has limited power to assist citizens in Russia. In Washington, D.C., a federal appeals court has ordered the Biden administration to stop enforcing Title 42, the public health policy to expel asylum-seeking families with children back to countries where they face persecution or torture. The Biden administration is still allowed to use Title 42 to expel other asylum seekers without due process during the pandemic, but a three-judge panel questioned whether the policy, first invoked by former President Trump, is needed. In Mexico, a crime reporter was killed in the state of Zacatecas on Friday, becoming the country's 7th murdered journalist this year. Juan Carlos Muñoz worked for the outlet Testigo Minero and was a part-time taxi driver in order to make ends meet. Mexican journalists have been demanding the government of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador offer protection and end immunity for the ongoing spate of reporter killings. In occupied East Jerusalem, Israeli forces shot and killed a Palestinian teenager Sunday at one of the gates of the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. Local press identified the teen as 19-year-old Karim Jamal al-Khawazmi. He was at least the 4th Palestinian killed by Israeli forces in under a week. In Pakistan, the death toll from last Friday's bombing at a mosque in the northwestern city of Peshawar has risen to 56, with nearly 200 others wounded. The Islamic State's ISIS-K affiliate claimed responsibility for the attack on members of Pakistan's Shia Muslim minority. Hundreds of mourners joined the funeral prayers for the victims.
इंसानियत की तजलील है।
This is an insult to humanity. This is a disgrace to Islam. Those who have been martyred were humans. They were worshiping Allah inside the mosque, and they were killed brutally.
A top United Nations envoy is warning rival factions in Libya to agree to long-delayed elections after a parallel government claimed power in the northeastern city of Tobruk on Thursday. Stephanie Williams, the UN Special Advisor on Libya, called on the new eastern government to form a joint committee with its rivals in Libya's capital, Tripoli, dedicated to reaching consensus on a constitutional framework for elections. Libya abandoned plans for presidential and parliamentary elections in December, and Prime Minister Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh has refused to cede power to an elected government. Aides to President Biden are discussing a possible visit to Saudi Arabia this spring to help repair relations and convince the kingdom to pump more oil. That's according to Axios, which reports the White House is scrambling to find new energy sources if the U.S. seeks to ban Russian oil imports. Minnesota Congressmember Ilhan Omar reacted on Twitter, writing, quote, "Our response to Putin's immoral war shouldn't be to strengthen our relationship with the Saudis, who are currently causing the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet in Yemen. Yemenis might not matter to some geopolitically, but their humanity should. This is a wildly immoral act," Ilhan Omar tweeted. Japan and South Korea say North Korea launched its 9th ballistic missile this year. Saturday's test comes just days ahead of South Korea's presidential election Wednesday. North Korea said the recent launches were part of tests to develop new reconnaissance satellite systems. Back in the U.S., New York City's ended a mask mandate for public schools and patrons of restaurants, bars, and other indoor venues, with no longer being required to show proof of vaccination. Mayor Eric Adams announced the steps Friday as daily coronavirus cases continued to fall far below record highs set in January, and after the CDC changed how it calculates the risk posed by the virus.
We are lifting the indoor mask requirements for DOE schools between K through 12 starting Monday, March 7th. And that is a great initiative. And I know there's some who state that they still want their children to wear their mask. You can.
Los Angeles also lifted its indoor mask mandate Friday. Meanwhile, a convoy of truckers opposed to pandemic public health measures has reached Washington, D.C., where they're planning a second consecutive day of protests, slowing down traffic on the Capitol Beltway. The U.S. Supreme Court's reinstated the death sentence of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, who's serving life in prison for his role in the deadly 2013 Boston Marathon bombing that killed 3 people and injured hundreds. The Biden administration's enforcing a moratorium on the federal death penalty, and Tsarnaev's execution is unlikely to happen anytime soon. In labor news, journalists at outlets owned by Geo Media, including Gizmodo, The Root, and Jezebel, who went on strike last week, have reached a tentative deal on a new union contract. The agreement includes higher salary minimums for all positions, a guaranteed annual 3% raise, trans-inclusive health care, 15-week parental leave, and investment in diversity efforts and transparency in how newsrooms are run. In Iowa, 7 people were killed, including 2 children, after at least 3 tornadoes swept through the state Saturday. Thunderstorms that triggered the tornadoes destroyed buildings, homes, and knocked down trees and power lines. And Vice President Kamala Harris joined civil rights leaders and activists in Selma, Alabama, Sunday to mark the 57th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, when state troopers violently attacked Black voting rights activists in Alabama as they attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
In a moment of great uncertainty, those marchers pressed forward and they crossed. We must do the same. We must lock our arms and march forward. We will not let setbacks stop us. We know that honoring the legacy of those who marched then demands that we continue to push Congress to pass federal voting rights legislation.
Among those who spoke was the Bishop William Barber. Vice President Harris was joined on her trip to Alabama by 5 cabinet members. After addressing the crowd, Harris, civil rights icons, lawmakers, and others linked arms to march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report.
Russia's war against Ukraine has produced a new battlefront for mercenaries. A report by the Wall Street Journal quotes US officials saying that Russia has recruited fighters from Syria to help in the bid to topple Ukraine's government. The report says that Moscow is specifically recruiting Syrians killed in urban combat who have killed in urban combat to fight in Ukraine. Russia has been operating inside Syria since 2015, openly supportive of the regime of President Bashar al-Assad. Now, a US assessment indicates that Russia is readying to deal a devastating blow to the Ukrainian government, pointing to a potential escalation of the conflict. The officials declined to elaborate on what else is known about the deployment of Syrian fighters to Ukraine or the status or scale of the effort. It's unclear how many Syrian fighters may already have been recruited. But US officials believe that some may already be in Russia preparing to enter the conflict zone. According to a publication based in Syria, Russia is offering up to $300 to volunteers who are willing to go to Ukraine and operate as so-called guards for 6 months at a time. Meanwhile, Russian intelligence claims that the US is sending terrorist units itself from the Middle East and Africa to Ukraine. Foreign fighters have already entered the conflict on both sides. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has claimed around 20,000 foreign volunteers have already travelled to the country to join Kyiv's forces. Some Chechen forces have also been deployed to Ukraine to fight for Russia, according to Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of the Chechen Republic and a close ally of President Vladimir Putin. Ukraine continues to remain in the hands of Zelensky's government. Its largest cities, including Kyiv and Kharkiv, also remain out of Russia's hands, though Russia has taken the port city of Kherson and continues its assault on most major population centres.
But Chinese companies are not behaving the same way, even as Apple, Nike, Netflix, and fashion chain H&M and many other Western companies have cut or paused business in Russia amid tide of sanctions and global criticism, while Chinese companies have so far stayed largely silent about their operations in Russia. The Chinese government that struck a no-limit partnership accord with Russia just weeks before Moscow's Feb 24 invasion of Ukraine, it has blamed NATO expansion for the crisis and urged talks to resolve the situation. On social media, Chinese public has shown overwhelming support for Russia's attack, which Moscow calls a special operation. Chinese ride-hailing giant Didi Chuxing, it faced a public backlash in China last week after it announced it would pull out of Russia, with social media users accusing it of succumbing to US pressure on Moscow. It later reversed the decision without giving any explanation. Lenovo, world's #1 PC maker, has also subjected to heavy criticism in China, a local Belarusian news outlet reported without saying where it got the information that it would cease supplying Russia. The small size of Russian market for Chinese firms would, however, make it easier for them to change tack and join foreign rivals in departing, especially as Moscow faces economic collapse due to growing Western sanctions. Russia's smartphone market, for example, totaled just 31 million units last year, or just 1/10 of China's domestic market size by comparison. By opting to stay in
radiation levels are now reportedly normal. Russian forces were said to have begun the attack in the wee hours of Friday, March the 4th, when Russian shelling set a 5-story building ablaze while one of the 6 nuclear power units was working. The building was reportedly at the plant's perimeter. The fire was subsequently put out, and Russia is now in possession of Europe's biggest nuclear power plant. The invasion is now in its 9th day, and reportedly over 1 million refugees have since fled Ukraine. US President Joe Biden urged Russia to give emergency personnel and firefighters access to contain the fire, as per the White House. And the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, that acts as the United Nations watchdog on nuclear matters, said they were in full 24/7 response mode. Previously, Russia had taken over the infamous Chernobyl power plant, the site of history's greatest nuclear disaster under the USSR. Many may recall that one of the first signs of the disaster was a fire that needed to be contained. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky harkened back to the Chernobyl disaster in what seemed a dear appeal to Europeans. He said no one has ever fired upon nuclear units except Russia and warned that the situation could become worse than Chernobyl, labelling it nuclear terror. How close did it get to becoming a nuclear disaster? It should be noted that as of now, the plant is working as normal and staff present at their stations. As per Ukrainian authorities, IAEA's head was deeply concerned about the situation, but said Ukrainian authorities had assured him all the vital equipment was unaffected. US Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm informed that there was no sign of raised radiation at the site. And Mrs. Granholm on Thursday had mentioned robust containment structures securing the reactors that were then being safely shut down. How could Russia seizing Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant impact the world? That said, given the context of Chernobyl when the situation occurred, it caused fears of a nuclear disaster. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, while the situation was occurring, called Vladimir Putin's actions reckless and possibly a direct threat to the safety of the European continent. Mr. Johnson seeks a meeting with the United Nations Security Council. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called the attacks horrific and unacceptable and called on Russia to stop them immediately. Experts have condemned the attack on a nuclear facility as unprecedented. Where radioactivity had escaped, the area would have been contaminated for many years. It is worth mentioning the Chernobyl plant is now surrounded by a 19-mile exclusion zone, devoid of human life. And meanwhile, the situation caused Asian financial markets to plummet. The bottom line. Earlier, hit with biting sanctions and the ruble tumbling, Mr. Putin told Russia's deterrence forces, which comprises of his nuclear weapons, to go on special alert, alleging aggressive statements from Western leaders. The US called it unacceptable escalation, as Western leaders have consistently maintained that NATO troops will not be sent into Ukraine. It is certainly a tricky diplomatic situation, with the humanitarian aspect for the people of Ukraine on one side and the West not engaging with direct combat with nuclear-armed Russia on the other. Foreign ministers in the West will meet Friday in Brussels. The UK Foreign Secretary called it one of the biggest days of diplomacy. Thanks for joining us on this report, and if you do like the information, let us know by liking, sharing, commenting on the video below. Subscribe to the channel and press that bell icon. You'll be notified of the latest videos from Kalkine. For further information, please head to the website at kalkinemedia.com. My name's Sage for Kalkine Media.
Uranium, uranium, uranium. The broader nuclear sector has had a lot of attention on it lately. There's been a lot of individual pieces of news which we'll explore all of today. But more broadly, the uranium sector is one that gets a lot of eyes onto it. Many investors believe we're on the verge of what may be a truly magnificent bull run, mirroring the one in the 2000s. Well, on the other side of the coin, there's uncertainties and natural doubts from some surrounding nuclear power. A lot of this sentiment surrounding it has actually led to where we are today in terms of the supply-demand dynamic and the willingness to deploy nuclear power. But in today's video, we're going to unpack the broader uranium sector opportunity, and we'll talk about how we're currently positioned and what this could mean for years to come, with a lot of different catalysts and tailwinds coming behind the uranium sector. Today, we'll talk about the uranium industry. We'll talk about the recent news flow. Of course, you might have seen the discussion surrounding the fire at the Ukrainian nuclear plant. We'll also talk about some new regulatory changes from global governments. And then finally, make sure you stay until the end, because we'll talk about what Elon Musk put out a tweet about today. And it definitely is quite pertinent and speaks to the uranium opportunity. Well, I guess the most logical place for us to start, before unpacking all the news and recent announcements and discussion, makes sense for us to take that step backwards and think about the uranium sector more broadly. What is the opportunity?
Of civilians from besieged
well, first and foremost,
cities,
nuclear energy
according to
is a clean source of energy generation.
Attacks are said to continue despite a proposal from Russia to create safe escape routes. out of major cities. And Ukraine has called a proposal from Russia immoral after it emerged that many of the routes proposed would only take civilians to Russia or its ally, Belarus. Stay with us here on OS for all the latest.
This is the BBC World Service, where we're looking at human nature.
I'm Dessa, the host of Deeply Human. I'm speaking to psychologists, animal behaviorists, mathematicians, historians, even a legendary Brooklyn DJ to ask the time-old question, why do you do what you do? This week, dancing. Why do we feel the need to move when we hear a beat?
You will experience that point where you just completely leave your body.
Deeply Human at bbcworldservice.com/deeplyhuman. You're listening to the BBC World Service. Following the crisis in Ukraine, we're making some changes to our schedule. Next, we're bringing you an edition of The Newsroom. For many of our other programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
This is ABC News with David Rowlands. Residents across a broad area in southwestern Sydney have been told to evacuate overnight due to flooding concerns. The State Emergency Service issued evacuation orders for East Hills, Chipping Norton, Georges Hall, Picnic Point, Pleasure Point, Sandy Point and parts of Landsvale, Holsworthy, Milperra, Moorebank and Warwick Farm. SES spokesperson Sandy Smythe says the situation developed rapidly, with authorities given no time to issue warnings and moving straight to evacuation orders.
So we've had quite a big cell that has dumped a lot of rain in that southwestern area of Sydney. So the rivers have already saturated and they've come up quite quickly, and the SES has now issued a number of evacuation orders for those areas.
The death toll from the Queensland floods has risen to 13 after the body of a man was found at Warwick in the state's southwest. Eamon Baghdadi reports.
Police had been looking for the 31-year-old since the 27th of February and finally located his body yesterday in the Condamine River. The grim discovery comes as dangerous flooding conditions continue to impact on parts of the state's southwest. Queensland Treasurer Cameron Dick says the cost of insurance claims on private infrastructure like housing and businesses is expected to reach $936 million. Mr Dick said there was still a long road ahead in terms of the major cleanup effort across the southeast.
Ukrainian authorities are calling for the immediate evacuation of 300,000 civilians in southern Ukraine as the humanitarian crisis there worsens. Harry Sekulich has the latest.
Residents in the port city of Mariupol currently have no electricity, heat or running water, and communication lines are down. Shelling has continued in a number of cities right around Ukraine as emergency services in Kiev report another 13 civilian deaths from an airstrike on the town of Makariv, roughly 60 kilometres west of the country's capital. Western powers are calling for humanitarian corridors to be set up, allowing Ukrainians to flee war zones. Poland has now taken in more than 1 million people escaping the war in Ukraine.
The UK, Canada and the Netherlands have announced a coalition to provide long-term support for Ukrainians. Mr Johnson has pledged more than $313 million of contributions to the embattled nation, while Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has announced further sanctions against Russian oligarchs. Mr Johnson is encouraging members of the international community to join the trilateral movement.
This is the moment for Ukraine's friends to create a coalition of humanitarian, economic and defensive military support to ensure that Putin fails.
The federal opposition has criticised the government's handling of its future nuclear submarine program. On Sunday, Defence Minister Peter Dutton said a decision on which nuclear-powered submarine to acquire would be made within the next couple of months. However, Prime Minister Scott Morrison says a decision will not be made until after the election, which is due to be held by the end of May. Shadow Defence Minister Brendan O'Connor says the government needs to clarify its plan.
There is a difference of views between the Defence Minister and Prime Minister at a time when we need clarity, certainty, consistency. We're not getting that from the government. I am sure it does not instil confidence amongst our allies.
Shane Warne's family members have shared their grief over the loss of the cricketing great. Nicole Asher has the story.
Family members have released a statement remembering him as the best dad and a much-loved and admired son. Shane Warne died on Friday while holidaying in Thailand. He was 52. Daughter Summer Warne wrote that she missed him already and that she wished she'd hugged him more tightly when she saw him for what turned out to be the final time. His parents say they've gratefully accepted a state memorial offered by the Victorian government. They're also thankful for plans to rename the Great Southern Stand at the MCG the SK Warne Stand. Thai authorities have confirmed he died of natural causes.
And wildfires are raging through the US state of Florida, forcing hundreds of residents to evacuate their homes. Florida's Land Management Services say one of the fires has forced a veteran nursing home housing more than 120 patients to evacuate due to ash and smoke. A further 700 homes east of Panama City have evacuated after heavy winds stoked a rash of fires in thickets of dead vegetation. No injuries or fatalities have been reported so far, though. This is ABC News. It's Tuesday the 8th of March and this is what we can expect weather-wise around the country today in the capital cities. In Brisbane, it's a warm one for you, 34 and mostly sunny as well. No sun in Sydney, unfortunately. More rain on the way, heavy falls as well, and it will be windy in the harbour city today. Canberra's in for showers and a top of 21. Melbourne will have a cloudy day with a high of 22. Just 17 for Hobart today under cloudy skies. Partly cloudy for Adelaide, where it'll reach 24 degrees. A perfect summer's day coming up for Perth, 35 and sunny, while Darwin will reach 33 with a possible shower or storm.
Hello, welcome to OS on the BBC World Service. I'm Nancy Kachangira. We'll bring you a sense of what's happening around Ukraine as we continue our coverage on what's now the 12th day of the Russian invasion. A way to bring the destruction to an end feels difficult. For the third time in recent days, there have been more talks in the past few hours between Ukraine and Russian officials. I'm just seeing some latest bits of information coming into the BBC via the Reuters news agency. It quotes a Ukraine negotiator saying the talks with Russia did not lead to a result that significantly improves the situation. The negotiator did say, though, there was a small positive development in terms of humanitarian corridors. We have no more details about that at present, but we will bring you more details as soon as they come in.
Uranium, uranium, uranium. The broader nuclear sector has had a lot of attention on it lately. There's been a lot of individual pieces of news which we'll explore all of today. But well, I guess the most logical place for us to start, before unpacking all the news and recent announcements and discussion, makes sense for us to take that step backwards and think about the uranium sector more broadly. What is the opportunity? Well, first and foremost, nuclear energy is a clean source of energy generation. It's actually very efficient when compared to renewables, and nuclear is being considered as a fuel to help decarbonise. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the discussion surrounding decarbonisation. We know that we need to bring down our global carbon emissions. And as we think about the phase out of fossil fuels, which we're currently seeing as we move towards net zero in 2050, there's going to have to be alternative sources. And nuclear energy actually serves as baseload energy that's reliable, and it is low emissions as well. To give you an idea about the scale, nuclear actually accounts for around 10% of global electricity generation. It's up to around 20% of the US electricity generation. And so with this global push towards clean energy and decarbonisation, this is why uranium and nuclear is getting pushed more and more to the forefront of discussions. And so with that understanding, it makes sense for us also to have a bit of a think about how we're currently positioned on the broader macroeconomic landscape. Of course, we know about everything that's playing out around the world. There's supply chain bottlenecks. There's the geopolitical tensions and uncertainties surrounding Europe. And all of these are feeding in along with the reduced mobility and border closures, which are still lingering around. It's feeding into a significant commodity cycle that we're starting to see ramp up, with calls from analysts and forecasters about a potential commodity super cycle that we may be entering. I'm sure you've all seen at the Bowser the increased price of gasoline and petrol. But there's been significant uplifts not only in oil, not only in wheat, not only in commodities, but the broader commodities across the board as well. And we can see here in the Goldman Sachs Commodities Index that we've broke out to new levels and commodities continue pushing higher and higher. And so all of that brings us to the question of how is uranium currently positioned? As we are all familiar with, there is still negative sentiment surrounding nuclear after a range of really significant accidents. Of course, Chernobyl is one that comes to mind, but more recently, Fukushima in 2011 really started the downwards trend that saw a protracted uranium bear market that we're just starting to recover from. However, on the other side of the coin, global electricity demand is increasing rapidly, and this decarbonisation focus, as we mentioned, means that we need to find alternative fuel sources. As you can see here on the right, coal and gas, these are sources that we want to start to transition away from. And of course, renewables are fantastic, but they are not able to be completely baseload and able to fill the complete energy needs that we ultimately will have. And so this is where alternative sources like nuclear are positioned quite interestingly. On the supply side, uranium also has an interesting dynamic. Because of everything that we discussed earlier, of course, there was a significant bull run in the 2000s for uranium. However, after Fukushima, sentiment turned rapidly negative. There was then a decrease in terms of the uranium prices, and so the prices started to move downwards and downwards and downwards. Uranium reached significant lows, and now we're still positioned well below that roughly $60 a pound mark, which many uranium analysts believe is that sweet spot where projects are able to come online and be economical. As a result of that, because we've been below this key level for so long and uranium prices have been low for so long, there has been a chronic underinvestment. Supply is starting to tighten up. Of course, there's been a range of other factors on the other side of the coin, including Sprott entering with their SPUT fund and starting to buy up uranium too. But in terms of the supply itself, a lot of projects are into care and maintenance, or supply has been significantly inhibited. And so, at the moment, there is not much supply coming online, but as the market looks for alternative energy sources, demand is continuing to rise, and this is where uranium is positioned. And so at a current state of play at a global regulatory level, we've also seen some sentiment slowly starting to shift. Germany, along with Japan, after Fukushima, really discussed the winding down and the phasing out of their nuclear power plants. They've been very focused on this, and they stated that this was initially final. However, after everything that's happened in Ukraine and an over-reliance that we've seen on oil and gas from Russia, and a bigger focus as well on localizing and building out supply chain resilience, Germany is now reconsidering its decision to shut down its final 3 nuclear plants so that it may be potentially less reliant on natural gas. It is a very interesting dynamic. Who knows how this will play out, but it shows a slowly shifting mindset surrounding it. Along with this as well, China is got a significant investment into nuclear, over $400 billion. They're planning on building at least 150 new reactors over the next 15 years. And for context, this is more than the rest of the world has built since around the 1980s, so this is a major investment. And then on the US side as well, there's been some investigations with the infrastructure bill. There was some discussions about the importance of nuclear power. Of course, it will depend how that actually plays out. But more than anything, it's showing that those who are in power, those who are leading, those who are looking towards the future of electricity and power generation are considering nuclear. I'd love to know your thoughts on it all too, so drop in a comment below what you think about the uranium sector, what you think about everything that's played out recently, and where do you think things head from here moving forward for the market. And so you might be wondering, with the tailwinds seemingly converging on the uranium sector, the potential for a longer term bull market opening up, why was many of the uranium stocks down by 10, 20, 30% on Friday? Well, this all centers around the attack from Russia on the Ukrainian power plant. It's actually Europe's largest nuclear power station, and a fire was started there as a result of that. There was a lot of fear and uncertainty and a lot of doubt about what this means. Of course, as more information and light has come to market, the fire was put out, radiation levels remained consistent, and the safety of reactors were not affected, but there was a significant sell first and then ask questions later. And this really led to the major drop that we did see on markets on Friday. However, in this session on Monday, we've seen many of these companies retrace a lot of these losses. And that then brings us to the mercurial Elon Musk. What did Elon say? So Elon Musk actually today stated that it is now extremely obvious that Europe should restart dormant nuclear power stations and increase the output of currently existing ones. And not only did he say that was important, but it is critical to national and international security. Elon Musk also stated that nuclear is vastly better for global warming than burning hydrocarbons for energy. And this is also notable because just over the past week, Elon Musk has stated how important it is to up oil and gas output. And so this is really building on top of that discussion, and he's stating how important. This is actually the first, as far as I'm aware, the first external backing that Elon Musk has provided for nuclear, but we all know how influential Elon Musk can be. So a lot of investors sat up and took notice of this. And so then you might be wondering, what happens next? First and foremost, if you did enjoy the video, don't forget to hit the like button. Feel free to share it out as well. We make daily videos every day, so make sure you've subscribed and turn your bell notifications on as well, and welcome to the channel. So I guess we're a few interesting catalysts in the medium to longer term. We see that Spot may be having a New York listing potentially this year. That is the idea. And if they can have a New York Stock Exchange listing, it has the potential to be additional fuel on the fire, as they really started to ramp that up in the middle of last year. Many will remember as Spot started buying, we started to see significant price signals and attention coming onto the uranium sector. So it'll be interesting to see if that follows up again. The utilities contracting cycle is also worth noting too. We know that there was a significant oversupply of contracts brought up. These are longer term contracts. However, as we move into the back end of this contracting cycle, these are going to have to be refreshed. And this is going to be very interesting to see the dynamics that this has and the implications this has for the uranium price too. We know the world's looking for alternative energy sources, and I do think it is worth noting as well that this is a sector that potentially could be prone to sentiment-driven moves one way or another. It doesn't invalidate any of the longer-term theses either way, but it is worth noting that. I think a lot of people look at the uranium sector and think it's going to be immediate. It's going to be just a sure thing or just around the corner. But these things take time. Who knows how it's going to play out? The market is a balance of probabilities. But investors are starting to pay attention because it looks like the tailwinds are beginning to converge. And as we move towards a decarbonised society, it's going to be very interesting to see the role that nuclear and uranium has to play as a part of that. Thank you so much for joining us. We've looked into a range of different companies and sectors on the channel recently, so we'll leave links to those up above. For now, stay well and happy investing.
This is Rob Johnson, President of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I'm with Ajay Chibber today to discuss his new book, Unshackling India, Hard Truths and Clear Choices for Economic Revival. He co-authored the book with Salman Soos. This is the kind of model of what I think we need to do. Everybody knows how to whine about what's wrong. You are creating a pathway to a constructive future and a vision based on a lot of experience in the Indian government, at the United Nations, at the World Bank, and many dimensions, which we can talk about in bits and pieces. But I really want to turn it over to you. But before we, glide down the pathway of your vision, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, thank you, Rob. It's so nice to see you again. And the book, well, I'll just hold it up just for a second so that people can see what it kind of looks like. But there are two big motivations to write the book. Salman Soos and I, we come from the same college in Delhi, and we worked at the World Bank together. but not together, actually. I never knew him, either in college or in the World Bank. He's a little bit younger than me. That's why I didn't know him in college, but somehow our paths never crossed. So we met each other about 2 years ago, and we liked each other's views, and we said, perhaps we'll write a book. But then suddenly we had the pandemic, and then we said, now we must write the book because we have time on our hands and, a kind of motivation to write. So there were two big things that were in our mind. One was that, both of us have worked in many countries around the world and in India. And so Salman also worked on a range of middle-income countries, so did I. And we said, look, whenever we go back to India and, there are some problems and you say, here's a solution that others have tried that has worked, the response you get in India is always, well, this is never going to work in India. India is so different. India is, completely, it's like India is, very, very unique in some way. But lo and behold, over time, you'd find that people would come back to those solutions struggling, but often very late. And people also in India like to say, we're doing much better than we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, which is true to some extent. But then the rest of the world hasn't stood still. They have gone much further ahead. And we know China, South Korea, so many countries have gone way past India. So you sort of say, well, you've got to bring a perspective that India is doing okay in some areas, badly in others, but where is it relative to what the rest of the world is doing? And so we tried to do this book as a bit of a benchmarking exercise, a kind of backward sort of indexation, which Indians love to do, but also a lateral indexation. So where are we and why are we where we are? That's one motivation for the book. The other motivation for the book is that, India had very big reforms in 1991 when Dr. Manmohan Singh was the finance minister of India. And India got into a huge crisis after 40 years of pretty dirigious sort of socialist policies. And then came a huge, a balance of payments crisis. And that triggered the wave of reforms that Dr. Manmohan Singh brought about. But when he brought his reforms about, he had a clear vision of how things come together and which are the buttons that I have to press now at this stage for India to propel it forward. And so over a period of 3 to 4 years, he was able to press those buttons with a competent team around him and, move things forward. So you've come now some 20, 30 years later, and those reforms have run out of steam. And for the last 10 years, India has been kind of drifting, especially since the global financial crisis. And then you've got a new government that comes under Prime Minister Modi. And you think, wow, this is the man who's sort of the big reformer, and he's going to carry out some big, big reforms. And what you find, and what we've documented in the book, is that you've got these very one-off, piecemeal kind of things, because there's nobody there, either in his team or around him, with that kind of comprehensive vision of what are the different wheels that have to move in some sort of tandem for, whether it's on education or labor reforms or other reforms. So one reason to write the book, we thought, was let's present a picture of how things come together to produce certain outcomes. And why does India have such a sort of distorted structural transformation, just to give one example. So the part of the book was, let's present a picture of where India has been over the last 75 years that has brought it to this point at its 75th year of independence. And then where does it need to go over the next 25 years? And how does the different parts of that sort of gearbox have to be moved in a way that will make it move forward in the right direction? So that's the second motivation for the book.
So when you look at, Wishmat, as you were saying, things kind of leveled off or stalled out a little bit. Obviously, the pandemic is a bit of a shock. The urgency of climate change on the horizon is facing us all. Yes. But how would I say, how much do those specific factors play into your design, and how much was what you might call related to a structure that wasn't functioning well before all of this came to the surface?
Absolutely, Rob. So, what we show in the book is that what the pandemic has exposed in stark terms, what the bigger problems were. The problems were there already. The economy had already, since about 2016, had started to slow down. And particularly the last 2 years before the pandemic, the growth of the Indian economy had gone back to pre-1990 days when India was growing at a very slow rate. One famous old economist who was my professor at the Delhi School of Economics, and I quote him in the book, Professor Raj Krishna, used to say, jokingly call it the Hindu growth rate, 4%, 4-5%. And what had happened was that in the last 2 years before the pandemic, we had gone back to now 4-5% growth. So we were back to, jokingly, I would say, back to the Hindu growth rate. And obviously, not a very good thing to say to a Modi government that is, kind of Hindu majoritarian is their ethos anyway. So I said, you've brought us back to the old Hindu growth rate. But what the pandemic did is then expose those problems and why we were in that situation. Even before the pandemic, we had very high rising inequality. If you look at Piketty's book, India is either the most unequal or the second most unequal country among the large economies of the world. Maybe in some Gini coefficient measure, slightly less unequal than Russia. But if you look at the top 10% share of their income, then India is actually even goes beyond Russia. And so, and now what the pandemic has done is has actually increased that inequality even further. The rich Indians have done much, much better, and the poor group have fallen even further behind. So, but what the pandemic has also exposed is certain things that were not so obvious, such as how weak the capacity of the state was to handle the pandemic. How many lives were lost that need not have been lost because of the weak capacity of the administrative capacity of the state. So I think it was sort of things needed a big change, but the pandemic has certainly been a huge wake-up call that has exposed these problems to an even greater extent than was the case before. And the fact that India had a very vulnerable employment. India has had about 80% of India's people who actually even work. A lot of people don't work because they can't find jobs. But even those who can find some job to do, 80% of them have what the UNDP calls vulnerable employment. That is, they have no safety net, they have no social protection. And that was exposed during the pandemic in spades, because when Mr. Modi did his drastic lockdown, and then about over 100 million people were then streaming back from the cities to the villages, it looked like some sort of a war or a story scenes that India had not seen since the partition of India and Pakistan. Of so many people out on the streets.
It's like the Wizard of Oz in reverse.
Yeah. and it showed that the vulnerability of this economy was huge. Okay? Mm-hmm. So I think what the pandemic has done is really exposed all this to a very great extent, and the weak health system, the weak administrative capacity, the inequalities, the lack of safety nets. And that's what we say now. We need to focus on these things going forward, but also somehow to be able to revive this economy from the slump that it had gotten into even before the pandemic. So today you will hear projections from the IMF that India this year will be the fastest economy in the world. Well, the main reason for that is that we had the biggest decline during the pandemic. So that's just a bounce back. They are projecting again that India will grow 9% next year. But I don't see where that growth is going to come from unless we do some serious reforms. And that's what we try and lay out in the book.
So in your title is the word unshackling.
Right.
So as we move into where India is,
yes,
and like you said, to be kind of silly about it, the unmasking that the pandemic has done has shown us some of the needs, some of the fault lines. But what shackles need to be taken off?
The biggest, the one very major point of our book is that the role of the state needs to be changed in very fundamental ways. That the state is not too large in terms of share of spending as a share of GDP. We have tables on that where we benchmark India against all the OECD countries plus several emerging market economies. But so the size is not too large, but the scope of the state, that is the number of things it tries to intervene into, is too large. And what that does is, it's a bit like, in taxation, you have the Laffer curve, right? If you try and tax at a very high rate, you start losing tax revenue. So here I use the Laffer curve sort of same methodology to show that if a state tries to do too many things, it ends up doing most of them very badly. And so the effectiveness of the state starts to go down. And that's what's happened in India.
So instead of being a catalyst or a channel upward,
yes,
it's like throwing a net on top of things, yes, and stifling,
yes,
vitality.
There's a famous writer in India, Gurcharan Das. He said most of the India grows at night when the state is actually sleeping. So we actually devote the first 3 chapters of our book to what needs to be done here, and we argue that it's got to be a 2-part strategy. You can't improve the capacity of the state overnight. That'll take time. But the first thing you can do is reduce its scope, meaning make it focus on a fewer set of things. And Modi has Mr. Prime Minister Modi has a big slogan on this. He calls it maximum governance, minimum government. Obviously not an original one, probably taken from somewhere else. But so we say, well, if that's your slogan, then the first thing you need to do is refocus the state on fewer things, and things which you have neglected badly, like health and education, and even defense. If you take out the pension component of the armed forces of India, we have a very large army. The actual spending on real defense spending as a share of GDP is one of the lowest since independence, which is amazing given the threats that India faces. We have China, and we have a problem with Pakistan, and loads of other issues that India has to deal with, but particularly China. And to have a sort of a nationalist strongman government have the lowest spending on defense because it's not able to move money from other various things that it's involved in, like building toilets and things, which are not bad, but I mean, that's not what a government's function should be. First, focus on health, education, defense. So that's one big theme we have in the book, which is where partly the title Unshackling India comes from. But then we say that it's over-centralized. China is a very authoritarian, totalitarian state, but more than 50% of spending in China is done at the local government level, not even at the provincial level, certainly not at the central level, at the local government, at mayors and village communes and those sorts of level of government. In India, that number is close to 4%. 4% of GDP is spent by mayors and village councils and things like that. Over 50% in China, to the level of so we argue that part of the reason why this government is ineffective is that there's and I use a methodology that was developed by a famous public administration expert and apply that to India, where we show that when you have things where the number of transactions is too high and the outcomes are not very specific, like in health and education, then trying to do those things in an overly centralized manner means you're not going to get the results that you need. So that's a big theme of our book, that we show that much greater decentralization, much greater, devolution to the lower level, and also that you will be able to get more for your buck at the lower level because salaries at the lower level are much less than at the central level. So we lay all this out in the book in the first 3 chapters. And also that we have still, while we may have liberalized in 91, we still have about 250 state-owned enterprises, public sector entities. We've just sold one, Air India, which is a marquee sort of airline, which was, a bleeding ulcer rather than a crown jewel, as Arun Shourie, a former minister who was in charge of privatization at one time, describes it. So, but I said, just as we were writing our book, the sale of Air India was on the sort of burner. And I said, this should be a litmus test. Can they do this or not? And they were finally able to do it and hand it back to the private company Tata's, from which they nationalized the airline. So that's another big agenda that they have to pursue, that we push for over the next 10 years or so.
When I had been traveling to India quite frequently, 2010 to 2016, I noticed quite large variations in local spending in different regions. It was not as if there was even if it was centrally controlled, it wasn't allocated as though it was a national policy. It seemed kind of like there was a customized policy for each area, and it appeared to me to be perhaps exacerbating inequality. And some of the leaders of regions that I would meet with would be very enthusiastic if they were in the inner circle and very despondent if they were outside. And your fellow Indian countryman and leader, Raghu Rajan, is a friend of mine, and I remember him starting work as he left the central bank on his book that I think became called The Third Pillar. We made a video together, and he was talking about at global levels, but also within India, at least in our conversation, that the need for local government is because you're sensitive to what people need there.
Yes.
But at some level, the federal government has to unify things across regions, manage migration between regions,
yes.
and what you might call local officials can't insulate their population from all the shocks that occur.
That's
you
true.
do need the combination of the big overarching government and the sensitivity down in the fields of where people live and where their yearnings are identified.
Yes. So we show in our book very similar that when it comes to natural disasters, we get lots of cyclones and earthquakes and various types of, which, countries are hit. But being a large country, we are able to handle now a lot of those disasters on our own. We, unlike large parts of the developing world, India doesn't look for foreign assistance when it gets, because you have a central government that is able to move resources, and an agency like FEMA you have in the United States, we have the National Disaster Management Authority. So there are things that India is able to run an election across the whole country very well. India is able to have a pretty competent central bank. It has the manpower and the capacity to do that. But then you ask the question, why can't it deliver basic health and education, right? Because it's tried to over-centralize everything there. And these are attributes or kind of services that are best delivered at the local level. India is a country more diverse than the European Union. So if you're trying to do whatever you were trying to do in Norway and you're trying to do that in Greece, it's probably not going to work, right? Similarly for us, you have, states at different levels of development. And even within states, you have districts, you have some states which are the size, Uttar Pradesh would be the 5th largest country in the world. So you have within states, you have also huge variation. So you cannot do these things at a centralized level. And that's what we try and show in the book, that you do need an overarching framework, but the implementation has to be left to the local level, and the modification of that national policy has to be allowed. We just passed the national education policy at the national level. But now if they try and ram that down to all the districts and all the states, it's not going to work. You have to say, this is the framework. Now we are going to allow different districts, different parts of the country to implement this in a local manner that meets certain broad objectives and standards, but gets delivered in different ways in different states. So that's where we need to go.
It's the old adage, different strokes for different
folks. But you do need an overarching framework, but the implementation has to be left to the local level, and the modification of that national policy has to be allowed. We just passed the national education policy at the national level. But now if they try and ram that down to all the districts and all the states, it's not going to work. You have to say, this is the framework. Now we are going to allow different districts, different parts of the country to implement this in a local manner that meets certain broad objectives and standards, but gets delivered in different ways in different states. So that's where we need to go.
It's the old adage, different strokes for different folks. And I think, but that sensitivity to the variations in the regions, I think is very important. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, where after the devastation of the auto industry, many things were not performing. And in many ways, people in Detroit felt that the federal government had divorced Detroit. After the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act were passed, Democrats in the South didn't want to transfer a lot of money to an African-American majority city in the North. And so it was very, very dysfunctional. And then people swooped in, whether philanthropic or government officials, to take over the education system.
Right.
And it felt like, to the people there, they have no idea what they're doing. They don't see the problems. They don't feel the problems. And and at the same time, by the way, they were building up the prison system. And then when a lot of black males were put into the prison system, which, by the way, were privatized and had incentives to fill their beds, then dysfunctional families did worse in schools. And as Heather Ann Thompson wrote about, she's a professor at the University of Michigan, all kinds of teachers who were being ranked on the standardized test scores of children left Michigan because they couldn't control their fate. And it was it was calamity from a top-down imposed thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give you a similar example, a friend of mine runs a very good, what Raghuram Rajan was describing, a very good NGO, Seva Mandir, which runs these schools in these villages. His school has one teacher And all the villages around in that area send their children to his school. And the government has 9 schools with no teachers. The teachers never show up. Beautiful buildings, computers, all never even unpacked. This little NGO school, people are moving from other villages to this village in order to be able to send the children to this school.
Wow.
And this one teacher is running 3 shifts in a day to be able to handle all these kids. Wow. So this is the reality, that if you leave things down at the local level, then people will know what to do. Anyway, so
what's in the realm of education, when you take the temperature of what's happening across the country, are there, I can understand being more customized, being more local, being more sensitive, but are there what I'll call mega or meta missing ingredients that you recommend in your book as a wholesale transformation?
I mean, the most obvious is obviously the amount of money. I mean, we have benchmarked India against all the neighboring countries, and we are underspending hugely. I mean, for example, our public spending on health is only 1.3% of GDP. It should be at least 3% of GDP. And out-of-pocket expenses are 2/3 of the spending is out of pocket by people. They have no insurance, and they go to half-baked, private clinics and hospitals. Same is in education. The amount of public spending in education, public schools, in the United States, what we are calling public schools, is very, very low. So most of the people have drifted into private education. And so you have these fly-by-night little schools that come up, private sector schools. Somebody will set up a school in their house in the locality, and all the children will go there, because when they go to the at least here there's a teacher, there's somebody who's trying to teach you something. Whereas in the public school, the teacher may never show up, and even if the teacher shows up, he may never bother to actually teach. So you have those sorts of issues as well across, not just in the rural areas, but across the whole country. So you have a governance problem and a money problem at the same time. You don't have enough resources, and you need a governance structure which changes the whole incentives. Now, what we have is we have seen an increase in enrollment, but the quality now we need to focus on, and which is the direction we push for in our book. We have a very good NGO which has been doing surveys for the last 15 years, and produces the annual survey of education results, which tells you that if you went to class 5 or class 2, at what grade are these children able to perform? And she shows systematically, and does this by every state in the country, how poor the quality of the education is. So that's where we need to now focus hugely, and this is where this new education policy comes in. But again, it's how it gets implemented will be very important.
I was going to say, from the distance, from my perspective, number one, with the advent of technology and automation, knowledge-intensive human capital is becoming ever more important. And secondly, when I have seen the products of the best parts of your education system, when I visited India or when people from India come to the United States, this is not what you might call a genetic or some kind of failure. This is a missed opportunity. You have lots of brilliant people, and if you were to increase the allocation of resources, the vitality, the productivity, the payoff to that input, I think, is almost guaranteed. And almost all of the parents I've ever met from India really cherish seeing their children educated. So I think unleashing these resources is just a win-win-win for the system and individuals and the world.
Absolutely. But, we trace back over the last 75 years why we came to this situation. And part of it is that in the beginning, when we got our independence, we focused a lot of our resources on what I would call tertiary education. We established, the famous IITs and the Indian Institutes of Technology and Science, etc. But most of those people, including Raghuram Rajan, they all went there. They all leave the country. A lot of them just leave the country. And we neglected primary education hugely. So we did not create a mass of people who were reasonably well educated. We had a small group of people who were in the best of the best, and then we had a lot of people with very, very poor or almost no education at all. So there was that problem, but that problem then starting to being corrected now to some extent.
People who have what you might call faith in the parable of meritocracy are saying the talented ones emerged and the others didn't. But there's an awful lot of statistical data. I'm thinking now about work I see in the United States, where students who test very well but are in the lowest quarter of the income distribution have much lower chance of getting a college degree than children who are in the upper 10% of the income distribution who finish in the lowest 25% on standardized testing. So there are a lot of things other than what you might call measures of innate ability or aptitude at work here. And it seems that investment that you're talking about, the broad-based uplift, can make an enormous difference.
Exactly, and that's what we are seeing. Our educator, Karthik Muralidharan, who teaches at University of San Diego, he's a guy who does a lot of work, and we quote him. He says, the whole system is now basically a signaling device. It's not a learning.
Yes.
It's not a system for learning. And even the richer parents, what they do is they know the child is not going to learn in school, so then they have after school tuition, and they pay a lot of money to people who come and then teach their children what they should have been taught in school. And so you have this intense competition for very few jobs. You have intense competition for getting into a college. And so the way the richer parents do is they provide extra help to their children, which the poor cannot provide. Then you have the digital divide. You have people who have computers and people who don't, and we show the numbers on that as well. So you think of India as an IT power, but there is a huge digital divide within India as well. And these days, without knowing computers, without doing that kind of learning, you're nowhere. Right? I mean, you cannot find the jobs in today's world unless you have that basic literacy, not just in reading and writing, but now in some at least basic computing. Now, of course, everybody has a cell phone these days. So through the cell phone, and we have very low data cost, but very low speed also, as we point out in the book. But nevertheless, people have at least access to cell phone. There are about 1 billion cell phones in the country. So pretty much everybody has access to something of that sort. So they're beginning to catch up. And but we need to push in this direction hugely.
Yeah, I remember when INET has had various projects related to curriculum reform, and I was in India, and someone said to me, "Don't take the curriculum that you generate and put it in an e-book that we have to get on the internet. Create a cell zone, create an app for the telephone, so people in the cell zone can get this free textbook because it will be much more widely disseminated."
Absolutely,
that's fascinating. I've also heard that in many parts of African development in recent years. But
exactly,
the interesting thing to me here, also, just before we close out on education, and you talked a little bit about it, and there's a lady who was a famous author in Canada named Jane Jacobs, often wrote about cities, but her last book was called Dark Age Ahead. And she spoke about the fear of unemployment that our ancestors talked about coming from the Great Depression, and the need to educate citizens rather than just credentialize people who were getting into school to get the job they were afraid they were going to miss in a very hierarchical society economically. Yeah. And I mean, it's kind of ironic because she was in Canada, which is less afflicted by these things, but she saw these trends coming. And the idea that comes back to my mind is you're talking about evolving the state, evolving the different ways in which things are done, bringing things to the local level. It feels to me like citizen education is very important as distinct from getting credentials as an input to production. Both matter, but the balance between the two of them, I think, is very important to the health of the society.
Yeah, I mean, we need to have a system where people are actually learning rather than just attending. I mean, and we have ended up with a system where focus was on enrollment. So enrollment went up. They finally, through the school lunch program and various other programs, they managed to bring the kids into the schools. But now, whether they're learning, I mean, that's the key. And the learning can't be only in the school, of course, but when somebody's there for 5 or 6 hours and they're not learning anything, that's a huge waste as well, I think.
I once visited a conference on the theme of economic justice, and the discussion among the group got to a place where it talked about health and education. Jim Heckman, who's worked a lot with INET, was the person who inspired me to join him and listen. But the notion of economic justice that was being used in the United States at that time is, if you get paid more than your marginal product, you're being subsidized. If you get paid less than your marginal product, you're being exploited. If you get paid your marginal product, that's economic justice. But you could be at a place of so-called economic justice where you couldn't support a family or a retirement or anything. And the question became, who is responsible for your marginal product? And the systems of health and the systems of education have an awful lot to do with your productivity that was beyond your control. They're system platforms. They're not individual laziness initiative or what have you. And the parable that it's all about the individual, I can understand assigning responsibility to the individual, but assigning responsibility in the context where if they are vital, give their heart to it, they can get the ingredients, particularly health and education, so that they are productive and can support a meaningful life. Otherwise, it's not socially sustainable.
So it's not just education. Now we need to then say, where do we find productive jobs for these people? And in our book, we show that our labor laws are so terrible. Partly we inherited them from British times, but then we added even more complications to them, so that it is very hard to actually employ people. And what it does is it makes sure that 90% of the employment is in firms which are smaller than 10 people. In fact, 80% are in firms of size 1, which means it's just the one person. There's no other person being employed. So, and that's where the point about the marginal productivity comes in, that there are no jobs. And now we contrast India with Bangladesh next door. Same basic structures, same institutions. Bangladesh then got rid of the labor laws, right? Pakistan did not. So Pakistan is still stuck. So when India became India, Pakistan and India kept the laws and both labor laws and then made them even worse. When Bangladesh got independence in 71, they threw out the labor laws. So this big boom in textiles is not just because of labor laws, there are other reasons too, but a very large part of it is. So you see a huge improvement in female labor force participation in Bangladesh and a decline in India, a decline in Pakistan. And so these girls who get some very basic education now are able to go to the textile factories and get jobs and become far more productive. I mean, they may still be getting exploited by the definitions you gave, but they're still getting far more productive and far better wages than they were working on the farm, right? So that's a big, big story. And when you point that out to people that you're now being compared to Bangladesh, not just to Vietnam which are now, I lived in Vietnam as the World Bank director in Vietnam, and that's a completely different, they've gone to a whole different level, let alone China. So, but even next door, Bangladesh now is saying, look, and their textile firms are 7 to 8 times bigger than Indian firms. They're able to now compete so well internationally. They're able to provide a lot of employment. I mean, they're like sweatshops. They're not the role model of a factory, but what was your alternative? Your alternative was no unpaid work on the farm, basically. And so that's, I'm not suggesting that we need to produce factories like Bangladesh, but we need to have a mass of manufacturing jobs. And India has what Danny Roderick called, and we point out in the book, called premature deindustrialization. The service sector has boomed, but the manufacturing sector, which is where the bulk of the employment needs to take place. If you go back to, say, Sir Arthur Lewis's sort of dualistic transformation of how people move out of agriculture and out of the informal sector into more formal jobs and more productive jobs and getting better paid and having a wage that, is not working poor. In India, you have a lot of people just working odd jobs, but they're still poor, below the poverty line, right? So that's the kind of transformation that we need to have as we show. And what would it take to do that? It would be education, but and basic health, because a lot of kids are also malnourished, and it would require some fund. So what India has done is taken its most abundant asset, which is labor, and made it very difficult to use it. It's taken its most scarce resource, which is land, and wasted it. And we show in our book, wasted in 2 ways. One is that the floor area ratio in our urban cities is one of the lowest, one of the lowest in the world. So when your land is so scarce, you start to urbanize, and then you have these sprawling cities. Delhi is 30 miles by 30 miles. That city could absorb all those people in probably 1/3 the area that it now occupies. So you take your most scarce resource and you use it badly. You take your most abundant resource and you use it. You don't use it at all. In fact, so little employment in the country. So how do you compete with anybody? And then what we did was we took the third factor, which is capital, and we ended up with, and we show in the book, the most inefficient banking system in the world. It compares to Venezuela and Russia, which are oligarch-run systems. So we show that the intermediation ratio, which is sort of what's the difference between the deposit rate and the lending rate, is in India is now 500 to 600 basis points. And that's because what we've done is we nationalized the banking system. Then all the crony capitalists and the populist politicians started handing out free loans or, re-greening the loans of crony capitalists who were willing to pay bribes to politicians. So I write in the book that this is like a murder on the Orient Express. Who's responsible for this? And it's it's everybody. They all stuck the knife in. It's the regulator, it's the crony capitalist, it's the crooked politician or the populist politician, and the bank manager, who's basically in a state bank. You're the bank manager because the politician wants you there to do his bidding. So we've ended up with this huge non-performing assets, and then the only way the bank can survive is by increasing the disparity between the lending rate and the deposit rate. So when you look, so this is where the reforms have to take place. That the first generation reforms that Dr. Manmohan Singh did were basically, in what we call economists call product markets. But the next stage of reforms, which India needs to do, are in labor, in land, in capital, and these cannot be done by the center alone because these are very heavily, provincial state subjects. So we can't do these reforms like they were done before, and a lot more discussion, dialogue, etc., has to take place between the center and the states to make this happen, and that's not happening in India.
I'm reminded of one of my earlier podcast guests, a young woman from, I believe she's from Singapore, but is at University of Michigan. Her name is Yung Yung Ang, and she wrote a book called China's Gilded Age, The Paradox of Economic Boom and Vast Corruption. And she compared the Chinese with the 19th century Americans and the concentration in the railroads and concentration of finance at JP Morgan. And she was essentially saying sometimes the corruption is used as propulsion, but if you will, creates systemic growth or a step in the ladder onto better things, then it's okay. But when the corruption becomes kind of stultifying, it stops the system from feeling any possibility of promise or future prospect. And I'm going to, when we finish this podcast, I'm going to send it to her because I want to see what she thinks would be the recipe for India in light of your book. I'll get her a copy of your book, and because it's a fascinating set of challenges that you're, how do I say, you're building this mosaic of many different dimensions that need to transform, at least closely in time, not necessarily simultaneously.
Corruption will be corruption. I call it the not the second oldest profession in the world. I call it the oldest profession in the world. But so we're not going to ever eliminate it altogether, but we need to get it to a level where it doesn't become, as you said, stultifying, right? So how do we do that? And we argue that one is massive deregulation. So, we used to have, when we didn't have the telecom, mobile telephony, it was so difficult to get a telephone in India, and people would pay enormous bribes to get it. But now, with the mobile telephone, we don't need to get the landline, so nobody pays a bribe there. Similarly, for many other things, when you had these monopolies, but more competition, more transparency, more deregulation, I think is the way forward to reduce corruption. When people will have other opportunities to get the service, then by itself the corruption will come down. And also more IT, a lot of the services are now done through the internet. So I think that makes a huge difference also to the level of corruption. We do have very high political corruption in India. We have electoral bonds, which are completely non-transparent. You're not required to even reveal who. So they've set up this electoral bonds, and anybody can buy them, but you don't have to reveal who you are. So a company can buy BJP-related electoral bonds or Congress Party-related bonds and never have to reveal who they are, except, of course, they inform the party concerned that they are buying their bonds and that a quid pro quo would be required, right? So suddenly all that corruption that was so visible has now become invisible to some extent. So you get the feeling that India is less corrupt, but it's just become more corporatized and regularized in some way. And in that sense, I guess there's progress because it's going more the American way.
Though I think in the United States, as I was listening to you just now, I can see all of these dilemmas because there are
no gas
what you might call platforms with increasing returns that look like a monopoly. And then there's what you might call restraint of trade, which is increasing profit margins and reducing the dissemination of things that enhance our well-being. How we construct antitrust in the age of internet and technology platforms with those increasing returns characteristics is a very important challenge. And then how, if we allow those monopolies, for society not to be what you might call subject to the whims of just a handful of people when it's meant to be a democracy is another challenge.
So in our book, we point out that we are probably headed
an
towards
insight there from Helena
a
into
Latin
the toll
American
this is
style,
taking on people's lives.
or
Thank
a
you for listening
plutocracy
to
of some
OS
sort rather
from
than
the
a real
BBC.
democracy, because the number of people now who control a very large part of the economy
ABC News with Anna Pikett. Good morning. Tens of thousands of residents across a broad area in southwestern Sydney have been told to evacuate immediately due to flooding concerns. The State Emergency Service has issued evacuation orders for Chipping Norton, Georges Hall, Picnic Point, Pleasure Point, Sandy Point and parts of Landsvale, Holsworthy, Milperra, Moorebank and Warwick Farm. SES spokesperson Sandy Smith says the situation has developed rapidly, with authorities given no time to issue warnings and moving straight to evacuation orders.
So we've had quite a big cell that has dumped a lot of rain in that southwestern area of Sydney. So the rivers have already saturated and they've come up quite quickly, and the SES has now issued a number of evacuation orders for those areas.
Police are asking the public for help to find a 67-year-old Indian woman and her 34-year-old son after their car was found in a stormwater drain in Sydney's west. Officers were contacted after the car was found in the Cooper Creek Canal yesterday afternoon. The death toll from the Queensland floods has risen to 13 after the body of a man was found at Warwick in the state's southwest. Eamon Baghdadi reports.
Police had been looking for the 31-year-old since the 27th of February and finally located his body yesterday in the Condamine River. The grim discovery comes as dangerous flooding conditions continue to impact on parts of the state's southwest. Queensland Treasurer Cameron Dick says the cost of insurance claims on private infrastructure like housing and businesses is expected to reach $936 million. Mr Dick said there was still a long road ahead in terms of the major clean-up effort across the southeast.
The Insurance Council of Australia warns some insurers will stop selling policies to people living in areas that repeatedly flood. Queensland Treasury estimates the cost of private insurance claims from the latest flood disaster across the state's southeast will exceed $900 million. The Insurance Council's Andrew Hall says the increasing frequency of extreme weather events is driving up premiums across the country, and some insurers won't take the added risk.
Floods are one of our most costly insurance events, and they happen in addresses that are well known. For some insurers, they will have no appetite for providing insurance in some areas. Some people may still opt to take insurance, but it could be quite expensive.
Overseas, and a third round of talks between Ukraine and Russia have wrapped up in neighbouring Belarus, where small positive developments have been made. Ukraine's officials says both parties have made agreements on logistics to evacuate civilians out of war zones, but the talks have not led to any breakthrough or bringing an end of war. European leaders are resisting a push from the US to ban oil from Russia over the invasion of Ukraine, as David Lipson reports from London.
The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Washington is in very active discussions with Europe to impose an embargo on oil from Russia. But with crude oil already at a 14-year high, making almost everything more expensive, Europe's big hitters are holding out. After meeting his Dutch and Canadian counterparts in London, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said you can't simply close down the use of oil and gas overnight. The German Chancellor said it was better to focus on sustainable pressure against Russia. David Lipson, ABC News, London.
Russia and Ukraine's foreign ministers will meet at a diplomacy forum in Turkey later this week to continue talks on a ceasefire. In other news this morning, the body of Australian cricket great Shane Warne has been driven to Thailand's capital Bangkok overnight and will be flown home to Australia later today. Southeast Asia correspondent Zoe Ford reports.
One of Thailand's most senior police chiefs, Assistant Commissioner General Surachate Hakpan, flew from Bangkok to Koh Samui to meet with Australian officials and announce the results of Shane Warne's autopsy. He confirmed the 52-year-old died of natural causes and that there were no suspicious circumstances surrounding his death on Friday. The police chief said Thai authorities would facilitate the smooth return of Warne's body to Australia, starting with an ambulance to Bangkok last night. His body will be flown home on a commercial flight today. Zoe Ford, ABC News, Bangkok.
Sport and the first cricket test between Pakistan and Australia is grinding to a draw after the tourists took further advantage of a placid pitch on day 4 at Rawalpindi. The Australians will enter the final day's play on 7 for 449 in their first innings, trailing by 27. Despite the perfect batting conditions, no Australian batsman has reached triple figures. You're up to date with the latest from ABC News.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
Good morning and welcome to Tuesday, the 8th of March for 2022. And coming up this morning...
It's been a quick and emerging situation, and we have progressed to evacuation.
Is growing fewer and fewer.
Tens of thousands of people in Sydney southwest ordered out of their homes with little prior warning after heavy rain and flash flooding. And also,
he has underestimated
very vast
Ukrainians.
ambitions.
He's underestimated their
we
leader.
are going towards
and
the Gilded Age.
He has underestimated the unity
that America
of the West.
got out
the world
of
continues to reject Russia's
but we are
aggression.
headed in that
Good morning, I'm
direction.
Glenn Bartholomew. Today's weather for the capital:
very
heavy rain
rapidly,
for
as
Sydney,
the
showers
Piketty
in
book
Canberra
shows,
and
the
possibly a
increase in
shower or storm
inequality has
in
been the
Darwin,
fastest
maybe
in
one
India.
in Brisbane as well. But we
you know,
start in New
James
South Wales,
Crabtree,
where
I
the
don't
flood
know if you know
emergency
him.
is
He used to be
intensifying
the
this morning
Financial Times
as torrential
correspondent
rain
in
smashes
India. He wrote a
Australia's
whole
biggest
book
city
called The
for the
Billionaire
second time
Raj.
in a week,
The
forcing
other
tens
person
of
who
thousands of people to flee
is
their Sydney
resonating
homes
with these
without warning
thoughts
overnight. The unrelenting
is a
rain
man
that
who
swamped river
encouraged
systems and
me
homes has returned,
to
triggering
watch
more
for
than a
your
dozen
forthcoming
fresh
book.
evacuation orders.
Kishore
Our reporter Manaz
Bambani,
Anguri is in
I
Camden,
believe
in
originally
the
from
city
India, but is in
southwest, where
Singapore.
several
He has a new book
evacuation
called
orders have been issued.
The Asian
Well,
21st
yesterday,
Century.
parts of Camden
And he
residents
talks
living here
about
were told
how
to evacuate by
the
9
American
p.m. or
leadership
risk being
wants
trashed by
us
flood
to
waters. Other residents were
emulate
told to
them
leave by
as the head of a
midnight.
world
They were told
system.
that if they don't leave
But
immediately,
with
they
all
could
of
risk
the
being trapped without
problems
power,
that are
without
occurring
essential
in the
items,
United
and it could
States with
become too dangerous for SCS
concentration
to come and rescue them. So they were told to
what he
leave
says,
immediately, take their
I
pets
think he
and their
wrote an
valuables
article
with them,
this title
and
in the
avoid
Straits
congested
Times.
roads. Now, I
For
came
the
here this
1%,
morning,
by
and
the
even coming in
1%,
here,
of
as
the
you can see
1%,
behind me, there's a road
as
here that's just
the
completely
democracy
flooded.
that
The
everyone's
end of the road
supposed to
here is
emulate
closed, so
in
people
the
don't come
US-China
through because
standoff.
it's pretty much impossible and very dangerous to drive through these flood
concerned
waters.
about
Now, the SCS have said that they're expecting the flooding to go down over the next day or two, but it's really dependent on how much rain we get over the next couple of days.
It must have been quite a late-night scramble for a lot of people. How worried, how concerned are they at the moment?
Well, the SCS have said that people have been complying, the compliance has been great. Camden was in a similar situation this time last year, so a lot of people knew what to do. They went straight to the local evacuation centre. Of course, there are people that are going to be extremely distressed. It's very stressful to lose your home, but overall, like I mentioned, SCS have said that compliance has been great. The main concern that SCS have seen is the amount of flood rescues they've had in the past 24 hours. So over the past 24 hours, overall in Sydney metro area, they've had more than 1,500 calls for help and about 63 flood rescues. So out of those calls for help, 45 to 50 have been here in the Camden area. And a lot of those flood rescues, again, are people who are driving through floodwaters, so they're really urging people against that.
That's our reporter Manaz Anguri speaking from Camden in Sydney southwest to David Spears. It's a pretty widespread evacuation order situation following locations Chipping Norton, Georges Hall, Picnic Point, Pleasure Point, Sandy Point and parts of Lansvale, Holsworthy, Milpera, Moorebank and Warwick Farm.
Let me know what you think. And he said, I love your book. He read it after 2 weeks. He said,
to keep abreast of that developing situation this morning. Meanwhile, residents in some of the hardest hit flood disaster areas of northern New South Wales are feeling abandoned by authorities as they deal with the mammoth cleanup task.
And
the
the
Premier
part
Dominic
that I
Perrottet
differ with him
conceded
is
parts of
that
emergency response
he thinks
have
China
been
and India will
unacceptable,
get together.
while the Defence Force has
And I
defended
told
its
him
efforts
that
as well.
what China
But
wants
in
is
Ballina,
not an
where
Asian
600
century.
homes
China
have been
wants a
directly
Chinese
affected.
century.
Our
They don't
reporter
want
Isabel
India
Rowe
playing any
found
part in
residents
it.
who haven't seen a single emergency response
and the joke I tell
or
him
government
is
official.
that in the Forbidden City, the question that people should be asking is, who lost India?
I'm just walking around some streets in Ballina,
and the answer is,
locals say in their collective memory it has never flooded in this area, despite it being quite close to the mouth of the river. But yet every single house in these streets, people are out with their gurneys, putting rubbish on the streets, cleaning, hosing. There's just barely a house that's been spared some damage.
We had a war with them in 62,
Rose,
so
Rose, yeah.
we had
and so this is your sister's house?
Yes.
And they both agreed
Rose
that
was out the front,
from
hosing
now
a
on,
pile
China
of
and
shoes.
India will
She's from Lismore, and her house there has been destroyed. So she's staying in Ballina and helping out her sister Rani with her flood damage.
For about
Rose
30
says
years,
the lack of organised help for flood victims has been devastating.
And
half my stuff's being thrown out because people have come and volunteered their time, which has been extremely kind. But it was before I was inside my house, so I've gone home to a lot of my personal belongings being thrown out. So it's just another thing that I have to
peace summits with him, or
had to deal with when I had lost literally every single thing in my life.
And with
so
the Belt and Road Initiative and in Africa, there's
a sense.
Some of my friends in India have often, as they visited me in the last 2 or 3 years, expressed a lot of concern about feeling a bit surrounded.
But as the flood hit,
and surrounded isn't just large, it's about feeling threatened as well. Like the belligerence has got to be a part of that mix for it to be frightening.
Bobcats, their own little...
I concur with what you're saying.
Utes, anything, full drives, they're all helping
but
us
I like
Kishore. I just pulled up his endorsement. I'm going to share with the audience. He said, can India have the largest economy in the world? Yes, it can. Yet success is never easy. But Ajay Chibber and Salman Soos have done India a huge service by documenting comprehensively the reforms, both painful and painless, that India should undertake. India should set aside its partisan divide, heed their wise advice. India should not rely only on its $2.7 trillion market when a global market of $80 trillion dollars beckons. If overseas Indians can compete successfully in global markets, so can India. And if India bravely jumps into the global market, India's economy will explode and seize the moment. That's pretty enthusiastic. I'd say you got an A+ out of that one.
So just over here, where was the army to
I must tell you that I'm a great admirer of Singapore.
It's a bing on your phone.
And in the book, I provide a little anecdote of when Mrs. Indira Gandhi visited Singapore at the invitation of Lee Kuan Yew.
Yeah, sirens.
After she'd been shown around
streets
the
away.
city,
He thinks
like
the situation has caught
70s.
everyone by surprise.
And
to my knowledge, I know someone
Indian journalist
for 44 years nothing has ever come up to this street in the bottom of the river.
And
so
she, in her very haughty, arrogant manner, says,
Max across the road,
but
he
it's
said
just
to me,
a city.
25 years, nothing. So.
I can build 20 of these any time. And the journalist says, Madam, why don't you? It will totally transform our country.
That's great.
So Modi has this idea of building 20 cities along the coastline. And they're starting with two big projects now, one on the west coast, one on the east coast. So they're picking up these ideas of, port-led development, but then at the same time, they're reversing the reforms that were done by Dr. Manmohan Singh, which is the trade reform. And that's the part I wanted to come to, that this bit about returning to protectionism and not joining RCEP, not joining trade agreements, this reversal, what they call Atmanirbharta or self-reliance, is beginning to sound more like the import substitution which led us to the old Hindu growth rate. And unless India gets out of this mindset, they think that we have a very large domestic market. And I tell them that, the second largest economy in the world is China. The third largest economy in the world is Japan. The fourth largest economy in the world is Germany. You're fifth or sixth. And these two, the number 2, number 3, and number 4 are the most aggressive exporters in the world. So why do they not think they have a large enough market? There's a $100 trillion market out there in the world. Yes. Why is your $3 trillion market?
And the Scandinavians, while they aren't on scale, the quality of life per capita is so high, and they have that same strategy that you've referred to.
Exactly. So I said, why do you guys focus on your domestic market and think it's a large market? It's not. And the Swami that they revere, Swami Vivekananda, when he came in 1850, when he came to Chicago at the World Forum of Religions, and they said, they asked him about India and its place in the world, and he said, look, we enter the world like a gymnasium to make ourselves strong. And the other example I give in the book is the cricket team of India. We learned cricket from the British. And for a long time, an Indian team could never win outside of India. It only won on Indian wickets, nasty wickets. But India's cricket team did not retreat into protectionism. It kept going out and trying to, and now we are the world's best. We can beat anybody, including England, anytime, right? So I said, learn from your own cricket team. Why do you think you will be world beaters in almost anything? And that's what Kishore is saying. Look at the Indians who go out. They become the best everywhere. So why won't you?
I know people will call me if we don't explore the role of India in climate change. And I know that's a part of your book because I went through that in preparation. But let's talk a little bit about coal transformation, scale, poverty, health systems.
Today's awesome video
are the highest and best uses of budgets.
Jumping right into this one,
what
this
role
is the
should
Ultimate
the
Ears
world play?
Boom 2. Claim to be super rugged, claim to be bigger and bassier audio.
And oxygen if you succeed.
As always, being upfront, Ultimate Ears did send us in for review. However, my assessment was not altered in any way. I'll be going over both.
Transformation, energy system transformation, because you're contributing to the global public good after the global north has burned most of the carbon that's put us in this CO2 problem. So what's the domestic policy, what's the international support that you envision is both just and vital for India's future?
So Rob, 5 years ago,
going over the physical features, this thing is indeed small and portable, weighing in at about 420 grams. Ultimate Ears, at least in the past, from my test, have proved to be one of the most rugged and durable speakers out there. The Wonder Boom 2 has that same water, dust, and drop-proof claims as the last model. So doing several quick drop tests here.
The mood has changed in the country.
Damn, it sounds horrible. But then bringing it back into my apartment and placing this into water, I did confirm that it floats. And shockingly, after those tests, after those drops, submerging it into water, the speaker barely leaves a scuff. If anything,
I used to argue when I was in the UN
from probably where that little pebble hit here. Overall, the speaker is still perfectly fine. Now check it out, the buttons up top. There's simply Bluetooth pairing, power, and right in the center is pause, play, and skipping forward. Unfortunately, you can't go back on a song with this. Rotating to the bottom and behind the water-resistant flap here, it's not USB-C, but micro USB instead. Really sad to see this on both Ultimate Ears and the more recent Sony speakers I just reviewed, since they're recently released products. This was a perfect time to future-proof these things. We don't get that chance. Not a deal breaker, of course. The speaker still functions obviously, but was hoping the industry would have
several of our cities
together. There's also no 3.5mm port for physical audio connections either. I usually don't need that, but maybe you need it on your end. The last button, which is on the underside, is the outdoor button, which is unique. It has the icon of a forest tree here. But Ultimate Ears is claiming this button does enable louder and crisper sound. It's a pre-adjusted equalizer meant for outdoors, which I'll give you my
this is a Western or developed.
Now touching base on the internals, I didn't see a Bluetooth rating on their website, but Ultimate Ears did claim up to 100 feet. With a Bluetooth performance, which is on the very high end. Testing this around my apartment, I was able to get a full 100% coverage. No matter what corner I went to around here, I never lost connection. The connection never even stuttered. The signal is going through several walls, and my apartment is about 1,100 square feet for reference. Now, testing this with video, audio played perfectly fine on both YouTube and Netflix. For some reason on my iPhone, YouTube was off-sync quite bad, but Netflix on iPhones works perfectly fine. Now last, and I do appreciate this, you can pair up to 2 devices at the same time to one of these speakers. No need to unpair it and then repair it to the new device when you want to switch sources. And last, this does have the ability to double up, so you can play 2 of these speakers at the same time. Ultimate Ears improved on this by now offering true stereo separation. You can hear left and right audio channels. The previous model only played audio in sync, which is still good, but
this is the direction India will
go. Even better, of course. All right, last but not least here is the claimed up to 13 hours of battery life, which is improved from last models, which is only 10. better than JBL's 12-hour claim, and still better than Sony's XV32 or 22 actually, which claims 12 hours without extra bass. I'm testing this at 50% vibe like all my other Bluetooth speakers. I was able to get 14 hours in 2 minutes.
That when you use it, you can cap it.
All right, folks, please put on your headphones or earphones for the best audio experience. If you haven't already, be sure to follow me on Twitter or Instagram. My username is Jimmy Leung Official or JLeung Official on Twitter. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And
I think they are doing. They are doing that.
All right, folks.
In spades.
Here we go.
So I'm very positive
first test.
that India will not be like China, which will have such large grounded thermal coal. China is now the third largest emitter in the world, and they're not going to be able to do anything about it because they have such a large amount of installed capacity already, and we don't. So we can make choices.
And there you have it, folks. Audio recorded on my end and then played through your speakers are not the best depiction of audio quality, but hence my review here. First off, you get very even 360-degree audio. You place this in the center for entertaining, and everyone's experiencing a very similar level of audio performance. This Wonder Boom 2 is loud, and pressing that outdoor button under the speaker actually helps big time. It's not gimmicky. With the outdoor button press, because in person, I can tell you the vocals are pushed very much forward without sounding awful weird. It's quite impressive. And I'm not sure if my microphones will able to pick that up, but if you see this in stores, I'm telling you, give it a shot if they let you demo this.
Now, this is a big factor in the United States, which is,
you can hear the difference.
I'll use my
Let's see if they eventually implement
place
this
of origin, Detroit.
Speakers.
People watched the transformation away from auto industry, globalization, automation, what have you, and they watched Detroit and Cleveland's people get crushed. So now people in West Virginia are saying, oh, it's great, climate change, wonderful for the world, how you can take care of us? You're not going to do to us what you did. In other words, there's resistance to change if there is an adjustment assistance. The old adage in free trade theory, we can make everybody better off and nobody worse off, requires transformation. educational
that I slowly walked away
compensation
from here,
and adjustments and education and subsidies and all kinds of things. You got to do the whole thing. In India, you do have an advantage that you don't have a whole lot of a sector that's going to get buried. Because like you said, 80% is new.
Outdoors or bigger open environments, that's where
maybe the opportunity cost for the other sectors that they didn't get to grow into it. But you're not knocking down something that was already built.
It's a bit more
we are hoping that
warmer
it will be
overall.
less. And also, you see, we are realizing that
the mid-range is clean, and with the outdoor mode, again, this is pushed quite forward, which I'm
so many of our cities have very bad
The mid-range is clean from my assessment with very much identifiable vocals.
It's in our backyard.
The overall instrument resolution and detail is not as full here, but as I'm trying to illustrate, the audio characteristics are designed more so to cut through the air for outdoor use.
So we have a whole chapter on this. We show this in
listening. Of course, you can have the latter. You can use this at home, but I'm just simply indicating that it just performs the best when it's outdoors. The high frequencies, as mentioned earlier, does sound a little bit jumbled, especially at high volume. This is quite typical for many small speakers on the market, where they have
big industrialists in India are all going into
instruments,
renewables
S's
in a big
and
way.
hisses in vocals, etc.
and the Adanis of the world.
So
they're projected
just like the other boom speakers they have on the market, these things are built
huge.
like tanks.
Now, what
I
we
do
have
prefer
to
the
do
audio
is,
characteristics on the
right
other
now we are still very
but keep in
dependent
mind
on
they offer
China
direct
for
audio
the
and that full
manufacturing
360 degree sound like the Wonder Boom 2.
Whatever
if you're needing a speaker for outdoor use, the Wonder Boom 2 not only gives you peace of mind there, but honestly, outdoor performance, this did perform the best. I highly recommend it in that aspect, that regards. So folks, be sure to check out today's video sponsor. They're offering a discount in the link down below. Go to squarespace.com/JimsReview to get a free trial and 10% off your first purchase. Squarespace gives people a powerful, online platform here.
That the feeling that
choose from
climate change is for the common good
modern as well as gorgeous,
involves, which Michael, despite what other disputes, a collaboration on that front is
simultaneously
we all lose if we don't collaborate. So I think it's treacherous, it's frightening.
Check them out, folks, with the link in my video description.
That is the endgame logic.
And for us, you see, there's that movie I produced when I was at the UN on the Himalayas. So you have the North Pole and the South Pole, but the third biggest concentration of ice in the globe is the Himalayan ice belt. And that has huge implications.
Is not available this year. I didn't see it on their website, but I have reviewed the XB32 and today we're reviewing the XB22. I consider this as in the small Bluetooth speaker class. I personally paid for this at the retail price of $99. And considering this video doesn't have a sponsor, feel free to click on my affiliate links down in that video description below. When you click on those links, they'll give you the most updated prices in real time. Like I said, I paid $99 for this, and I think they're going for about $79
but the interesting thing is
when that happens. Anyways, I'm Jimmy with Jim's Reviewer, and I'm here to help you make that purchase decision.
You see, there's a lot of this fad about net zero. But as a lot of these people are pointing out,
first,
the
out of the two
path to
speakers,
net
the
zero is very
XB32 and the
important too, because it's
XB22, the XB22 has a fixed color. Mine comes in white
so you could get
LEDs,
to
and it blinks and
2050, say,
fades
in
to the music.
world.
The lights don't go all the way around.
Or China says 2060, but if China doesn't do anything till 2040 or 2050,
but
then starts to.
They finally had the small
but
speaker
it would have emitted,
be a little bit more colorful.
It would have eaten up the entire balance.
The construction is really good, just like the other models. It's also
CO2 balance that's left out there for us to get to.
Testing this confirmed it's
so
waterproof, and it does
as
people
well.
have become
too old and enamored with
perfect for the
net
beach,
zero
sandy
targets,
areas and dusty, dirty environments.
The glide path is very
also
important
drop resistant.
to get to that.
The controls on top are pretty much very straightforward with the live sound on the very far left, which I'll demonstrate shortly. The pause and play button also works as going back and forward on your song, which is
I really want to pay tribute to you because it's not just optimism.
And last is of course
thoughtful
volume up and down
optimism.
and the power and pairing
Given
button. On the far left, and I think it's losing its appeal as not many
the depth of your
really
research,
talking about this anymore.
it's credible
NFC,
optimism.
And
I think this book is an extraordinary
Tap your phone on here, and it
contribution
not
only to the path forward in India, but to the path forward for intellectuals to make
now, rotating
a
to the back
contribution
behind this
to
water-resistant
the calming of
flap,
nerves
I
and our
wish
future
these buttons
well-being.
were on the top of the speaker outside instead of hidden back here, but you have the ability to turn on and off the LEDs.
We don't
you
believe
can check
that
the
Putin,
battery life, which gives you a verbal response, which is also another huge plus.
Is that he's putting the Russian military, the Russian security
and then there's
services
WPC, which stands for Wireless Party Chain, allowing you to connect multiple Sony XB speakers together. Now, I did test and confirm last year's model Sony XB31 was able to pair with this year's XB22, so that's huge. That's really good news. They're compatible. Setup was easy, and I didn't have any kind of syncing issues. The last button is called Add, which allows you to pair two of these speakers to play together in sync, and also in stereo. Now, there's a 3.5mm port for physical connections, and very last, Sony went with micro USB for some reason here to charge the speaker. I know some will be let down by this if you're looking to future-proof yourself. JBL sadly doesn't have this new connection either. The only two other speakers that I can think of that is popular and mainstream is the LG PK series and the recently reviewed Marshall Stockwell 2. Now, jumping into connection tests, Bluetooth 4.2 is offered, which is still very good in my book, but it's not the best. Bluetooth 5.0 is the highest standard at the moment, and most new phones have this. So testing this distance-wise, I was able to get about 90% coverage here in my entire apartment. The apartment is about 1,100 square feet for reference. Testing this with video on my Android Pixel 3a phone here. YouTube was horribly off sync for some reason. I did test this with Netflix. Netflix did fare a little bit better. I also tested this with my iPhone, and it did actually do better. Netflix played with no issues at all. YouTube played with a little bit of a delay, though, unfortunately. So, video goers, I wouldn't highly recommend this speaker because of the syncing issues in general. Again, look for speakers that are Bluetooth 5.0. Now, moving on, battery life is rated at 12 hours with 0 LEDs. That's basically leaving the LEDs off and leaving extra bass off. I tested the XB22 with everything on, though, just to see what this product is capable of, and I got 6 hours and 54 minutes to be precise. And last but not least, the speakerphone option performed decent. It's hard to find a speaker that performs exceptionally well. The XB32 had a good bit of reverb from the other person speaking, but on this particular model, the XB22, the other person didn't hear their own voice at all. On my end, when speaking, the other person noticed that they heard me with a slight echo, pretty common on speakerphones in general, and then standing about 3 feet to 5 feet away, my voice was audible, but once I got to about 8 to 10 feet, it gets obviously harder to hear me at a louder volume. So that's it. Let's get into the audio test. Please put on those headphones or earphones to hear my binaural microphones. Please show your support by liking and throwing some fire emojis down there. And yes, Bose active noise canceling headphones are
territorial integrity,
here we go,
political independence of Ukraine, Belarus,
Kazakhstan, ADF personnel have been deployed to help
which,
with the flood.
as a result of other agreements and memorandums between 1993 and 96, Belarus, Kazakhstan,
really
and Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons.
Then play through your speakers are not the best depiction of audio quality, but hence my review here. Now, compared to last year's Sony speakers, it's as though Sony went
Ukraine had the third largest
act together. The fix really helps here. It eliminated that boxy and distorted bass that we heard. Now it's cleaner. It's still bassy for a small speaker, and the general quality of the extra bass function is just that much better. The speaker itself can fill up small rooms, and surely enough for medium-sized open areas. If you're using this in a large open area, though, say like a two-car garage, this will surely be enough for casual listening. The mid-range is where you hear most of your musical instruments and especially vocals. The XB22 is good with having singers sound present. Instruments are clear enough, distinct, and it's not necessarily boxy recessed, but the mid-range isn't standing forward and being really bright. The entire mid-range felt right in the middle, you can say. The high notes for snares, cymbal crashes, high frequencies, can use a little bit more detail and resolution up top, but it performed very similar to how the mid-range did as well. Not underwhelming, but surely not
On May
bad
23rd,
either.
1992,
And with Bluetooth
Russia,
speakers and how
United States,
small
Belarus,
they are,
Kazakhstan, and
most don't
Ukraine
even offer
signed the
any
Lisbon
soundstage
Protocol.
or audio separation, more specifically stereo left and right channels.
SCARP 1
The
treaty was a
XB22 and
bilateral
XB32
between the
does
United
offer
States
this thing called
and the
live
Soviet
sound,
Union,
and on the
but the
bigger 32
reduction
model,
and
I can tell the
limitation
audio is just slightly wider,
the bar.
almost to the point where the
Treaty
audio
was signed
sounds
on
like it's
July
coming from the
1st,
side of that
1991,
speaker
and entered
versus
into
the
force
front.
on
Now
December
with
5th
this
of
model, the
1992.
XB22, I didn't get that unfortunately, and
Protocol
it could be
committed
very well
Belarus,
the speaker is just too
Kazakhstan,
small.
and
I hear it
the
change from extra bass to
non-nuclear
live sound, but the
nuclear
experience of
program
that wider soundstage
as
wasn't
non-nuclear
as
weapon states
impactful. It wasn't
as
as
soon
wide
as
as performed
possible.
very similar to other Bluetooth speakers on
However,
the
the
market.
terms
Now, last but not
for the
least,
transfer
Sony
of
speakers
the
do
nuclear
offer
warheads
LDAC, which
were not
allows you to
agreed.
play high-resolution
Some
audio files
Ukrainian
with the least amount of
officials and
degradation through
parliamentarians
wireless signal.
started to
I
discuss
honestly
the
don't know
possibility of
resolution audio
obtaining
files with the
some
least amount of
the
degradation
modern
that
Ukrainian
perform
built
very similar to other
RT-23
Bluetooth speakers on the
missiles.
market. Now, last but not least,
Russian
Sony speakers do offer LDAC, which allows you to play high-resolution
Following
audio
year,
files with the
two
least amount of
regiments of
degradation through a wireless
110
signal.
missiles
I honestly don't notice a
in
difference
Ukraine
between or because
with
the
more
audio characteristics on
storage
each speaker are
warhead
so
components
different.
on the
LDAC is good in general for
faster
audio,
operation life
but I wouldn't hold too
and
much
Ukraine
weight on this
political
to
leadership
impact
realized
your
that
purchasing
Ukraine
decision.
could
I'll probably
not
focus
become
more on that on
credible
headphones and
nuclear
such.
military
So folks, find me on my personal
Nuclear
Instagram,
warheads
Facebook, or Twitter. I'll have my links down in that video description below. You guys take care, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye.
Bigger name brand models out there. I think that's what you guys are looking for. And calling out the hype, seeing if it's actually good, and as always, helping you guys make that purchase decision. But anyways, today we're looking at the DOS Soundbox Pro Plus. This is the newest model that I asked for them to send out to me. This looks nearly identical to one of these Sony speakers I reviewed a little while ago, with the extra bass button up top, with the LEDs and such. And of course, I'll be testing the audio on this versus some of the other popular models out there. Again, the Sony XB22 and the JBL Flip 5. Now, the Soundbox Pro Plus is less than $100, actually less than $70 at the time of this video. I'll leave my affiliate links down in that video description below. Click on those links for the most updated prices in real time. You never know when this thing might go on sale. I'm Jimmy with Jim's Review Room, and I'm here to help you guys make that purchase decision. Welcome, everyone, to another review.
Currently down 2.3%, 97 points on the NASDAQ index.
Going over the physical features first, it surprisingly doesn't feel cheap. There's this rubber-like texture going all the way around the speaker right here, and when you're holding this, it doesn't feel hollow or built with thin plastics. And there's a little weight to this thing, actually. Not heavy, but it is still portable for my taste. Now, not many Bluetooth speakers offer drop resistance, but we don't get that here either. What we do get, though, is IP5 water resistant rating. This means the Soundbox Pro Plus is able to take on water jet sprays from any angle. Now, with my testing with clean, clear, and natural water, sometimes things may be nasty in my videos for some reason, but the speaker has been perfectly fine. It doesn't have the IP7 rating like the JBL Flip 5 or the Sony XB22, which is my two chosen bigger brand speakers in this review. So this DAW speaker can't be submerged underwater. But if you don't think you're going to drop this into the pool, I think you'll be fine. Now, getting a closer look, buttons are very clicky and responsive at the top here. Everything is really self-explanatory on screen. The three biggest features to highlight, though, is the extra bass button, the mode button to cycle through your LEDs, and last is the add button up top here, which allows you to pair two of these DAW speakers and have them play wireless stereo separation. This works really fast and at times nearly instant. Now, regarding those buttons here, the only thing missing, actually two things missing, I don't have the option to skip and go back on a song physically on the speaker. JBL and Sony does offer this, and there's no real battery level indicator. It only shows red when it's near death with a TH. And I might have one of these again. But having several LED lights to indicate battery life, or what Sony does, which is voice prompt, I think would help out big time in my personal opinion. Now, rotating to the back, the flap here works great at preventing water from getting in. But behind here, you have the micro SD card slot, a 3.5 5mm port for physical connections, and last is a micro USB port. We don't have USB-C, which is the latest and greatest. Oddly, Sony doesn't have it either, but the JBL Flip 5 does. Now, regarding battery life, the older version of this DOS model was rated up to 10 hours of use. This new model recently released claims up to 15 hours without the LEDs on. With my testing at 50% VOM and leaving the LEDs on, I was able to achieve 10 hours and 7 minutes worth of use. Now, to put this into perspective, the Sony XP22 with the same exact test here got 6 hours and 54 minutes of real-world use, and my JBL Flip 5 achieved 8 hours and 44 minutes. The budget brand surprisingly beats out the two expensive ones. Now, moving on here, let's talk about the LEDs real quick. This might be one of the few budget speakers out there that even offers this, let alone there's only a few mainstream speakers that offers LEDs as well. Now, the JBL Pulse 4 comes to mind, the Sony XP speakers, LG are the main...
Because the river peaked at about 5 meters. Now, this comes
ones that are just off the top of my head here, but again, for less than $100, this offers multiple colors right here, and the drivers behind the grill also
dealing with that, moving it off to tips in trucks.
Versus the
There is still people who need assistance. They'll be helping there as well. Thankfully, yesterday we saw a sunny and clear day, so hopefully there isn't much more to claim.
Now with DOS, you can always change the colors and change the patterns available by pressing on the state button or by holding down the strip base button. Now the selection or sequence could have been a little bit more different or a little bit better in my personal opinion. Some of the changes don't seem too drastic, but overall the display does look good though. I just essentially just keep pressing mode and extra base until I find one that I really like. Alright folks, let's get into the wireless performance and then we'll protest things. Now we have Bluetooth 4.2 across all three devices. Super Strength, the Soundbox Pro Plus was able to cover about 80% of my 1,100 square foot apartment before the signal started to cut out. The JBL got 80 to 85% coverage, while the Sony did the best with 90% coverage. And I did triple check this. But for video signal delays, testing this on my brand new Pixel 4 XL, which I have right here, Android smartphone, and of course my iPhone 10, I didn't have any signal delays in general. From my experience, if I were to nitpick, maybe there's a slight delay with the DOS here, but it's very minimal. The JBL was a very similar experience, and then the Sony unfortunately had delays on the iPhone, especially with Bluetooth. Now, as for multi-pairing Sony and the JBL, I was able to have them remember two devices, and I could switch between them both exclusively. With the same tester, I couldn't do it with DOS. I couldn't pair two devices at the same time, and that was a huge problem. So, after years of testing here, I still don't think there's a perfect product, although DOS might not have the latest Bluetooth and battery port connection, the price might justify it. But with my testing, performance-wise, it's still able to keep up for the most part. But
Budapest
memorandum, audio. Let's get into that next here. Before I start, make sure you put on those headphones or earphones to hear my professional 3D like recording. Let's see sound. All right, folks, get ready.
Non-proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Primarily, they come in. It's a non-defense.
And they both agreed that one,
the Soundbox Pro Plus bass hits low and similar to the Sony XP22. Now, don't expect the desk to be shaking in such here for performance, but for two small speakers, they do provide a little bit of help to your music, and I do appreciate that. It's really good. The JBL, on the other hand, has a bass experience as well, but it hits more so on the upper end, sounding like a bass-exclusive audio signature versus being as deep here as the first two speakers mentioned. It's a matter of preference. Case I'm going to prefer. Now, the mid-range is where things are much different here. JBL offers right and forward mids, which I personally love. You might have heard that in the audio samples. The Sony sounded the most muffled here. Out of the three, it sounded the most suppressed. The DOS exhibited what I interpreted as the in-between ratio to these speakers. It's not too bright and not too recessed. All three speakers didn't offer a huge sound stage like most Bluetooth speakers, and the stereo separation was nearly nearly non-existent. The high frequencies, Sony was the most underwhelming, with DOS being the very high end here. At much louder volumes, the DOS can get pretty high pitch and lose its accuracy. The JBL, compared to the two other speakers right here, started to have a little bit of roll-off to prevent it from being too exaggerated. Overall, being 100% transparent, I do prefer the sound of the JBL Flip 5 overall. It sounds cleaner, and I do prefer that forward sound signature. But the DOS Soundbox Pro Plus, being less than both of these speakers in price, offering the LEDs, offering better battery life in real-world testing, and a sound signature that was, again, in between these two other more expensive speakers.
It has never taken on such obligations.
One that hits right in the middle. I gotta give some praise to the Soundbox Pro Plus. Not everything is perfect, but the price on the DOS, I believe, justifies it. Folks, let me know down in that comment section below what you guys think about these budget reviews in general, about this speaker, the DOS Soundbox Pro. What's the best feature of this reviewing family? It's been a busy time of year, and I know I can't be fully aware of every product that's being released. But thanks to you guys and so many suggestions coming in, I'm reviewing an item that the fans have suggested. Today I'm reviewing a massive Fugu XL that I personally paid for, priced at $299 retail. And what I'll do is I'll place a link in the video description below for you guys to click on, and that way you can see the most updated prices as of today. And last, before I begin, you'll see the JBL Extreme here from time to time, since many were asking for me to do a comparison. So without further ado, I'm Jimmy with Jim's Review Room, and my channel is here to help you make a purchase decision. Welcome everyone to another video.
There should be more resources
headliner, not yet.
Everybody,
Russian NATO enlargement, red line
involved in these disasters, and such a job that it's
going over the physical features first. For a Bluetooth speaker, this is quite large. It's technically still portable, but more holding it within your arms rather than using a book bag or such. When you put this side by side, the Fugu is a bit more narrow versus the more rounded design on the JBL. The Fugu weighs slightly less as well at 4.2 pounds versus the Extreme, which weighs it at 4.6. Now going over the layout, the top has all of your physical buttons that glows in the dark, which is a nice feature. On the left has your play button with skipping and going back on tracks on either side. Volume down, an action button for answering phone calls or disconnecting is right in the middle, and last to the right is volume up. All very clicky and very responsive too. Rotating to the sides, one ear has your power on and off with a 3.5mm auxiliary port for connecting your devices physically. Next is the Bluetooth pairing button, and last, which I personally did not find convenient, is the LED information. To view how much battery you have left, you tap on the power button, and you have to count how many blinks you would see. One green blink being low, with 6 blinks being full, offering an array of LED lights like most other Bluetooth speakers would have helped, but the Fugu does disclose audibly the estimated amount remaining. And since we're on the subject, the Fugu XL is charged with a supplied wall adapter, and you don't necessarily charge this with a USB cable like the JBL Extreme and most other large Bluetooth speakers. Battery life is claimed to be a crazy 35 hours of use on this thing, with my test at 50% volume to get a median result. Leaving this on overnight and partially into the next day, I was able to achieve a still very impressive 27 hours and 23 minutes straight use until the unit died. But going back to the connections, the other side features a tight seal here for waterproofing purposes, which I'll demonstrate shortly. But behind here, you'll find a micro USB port that is only used for updating the speaker's firmware, a DC port to charge the Fugu XL with, again, the supplied wall adapter, and last, a charge-out port for charging your phone and other random devices via USB. Overall, the Fugu comes really rock solid here, and one of the biggest selling features is the design, not the aesthetics, but the build quality. The design features a shell, which you see here, though rotating to the bottom, I'm going to demonstrate. I'm going to take out these 2 screws that releases the core and it slides out the unit. Physical features that does make the Fugu a considerable choice includes being reinforced with a fiber resin, making this shock resistant from drops up to 3 feet from the ground. It's also dust and sandproof, with last being waterproof up to 3 feet in water for up to 30 minutes. And despite being one of the heavier speakers from my test, it did prove that the Fugu does float, so the 3 feet maximum shouldn't really be an issue for that happens to the blade. And very last and very notable, this is one of the few speakers that can output 360 degrees sound. There's speakers on the front,
southwest.
Rotating the Fugu here.
The body of
There's
Australian
speakers on the
cricket
rear
great
as
Shane
well,
Warne's
and
being
very
driven
well
to
on the
Thailand's
side.
capital
The only
Bangkok
other
overnight
speaker in
and
this
will be
class
flown
that
home
can
to
output
Australia
Russia's
later
sound
today.
is the
And a third round of talks between
So
Ukraine
far,
and
everything
Russia have
sounds
wrapped
amazing.
up,
Since
with
from
both
my test here,
parties
this
making
did
agreements
confirm
on
to be
logistics to
built like a
evacuate
tank.
civilians.
Everything so far sounds amazing as well, but this leads me to the sound quality. I'll play several songs and then give you my verdict afterwards.
Meanwhile, the United States has tried to calm fears among its Baltic allies, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, that they could be next in Russia's plan to redraw the boundaries of Europe. The US believes Russia has now committed nearly 100% to the forces it had amassed around Ukraine's borders. North America correspondent Carrington Clark is in our Washington bureau and has been listening to the latest Pentagon briefing. Carrington, good morning. What have defense officials in the US had to say about Russian troop movements?
Well, good morning to you, Glenn. They say that at this point it does appear that that Russia has has utilised about 100% of the troops, the military that they had used to encircle Ukraine. So basically all of the forces that were assigned to this mission are now being utilised. But they say it does appear that Russia has stalled in its invasion attempts in most of the country. They say there is some progress being made by Russian troops in the south, coming with the Russian troops who've come through Crimea. But in the north, and particularly with the all-important capital Kiev, it does appear that the Russian military forces have stalled, and that they say is a result of both the fierce resistance that we are seeing from the Ukrainian defenders, but also the logistical issues that Russia seems to be experiencing in getting their troops to where they want them to be. So at this point, it does appear that Russia has stalled in those major northern eastern attempts, but there is some progress in the south. Interestingly, they say that the airspace is still contested. So this has been a kind of point of disagreement among different analysts, but they say that the Ukrainian President Zelensky, is still in charge of a Ukrainian air force, and it is able to defend itself, at least in part. So Russia does not have complete air superiority, and Ukrainian forces are still in operation.
All right, so I'll be curious to see whether that US suggestion to provide jets to Poland, if Poland were to send its jets to Ukraine, does come to pass. In the meantime, what can you tell us about this suggestion that Russia may even be attempting to recruit Syrians to fight in the invasion of Ukraine?
So the Pentagon says that their intelligence suggests that that Russia is attempting to recruit Syrians to fight, to supplement the forces that Russia has assigned into Ukraine. They say they don't know whether or not they've been successful at this point in recruiting Syrians, or how many Syrians they want to recruit for the job. But this obviously concerns people, that it may indicate the type of battles that Russia is planning on fighting, going city to city, fairly brutal combat, but a concerning development. And on that issue of the US supplying US-made jets to Poland, if Poland was to send Soviet-made jets to Ukraine, the major issue seems to be whether or not Poland's willing to do that. It's obviously a very high-risk movement from Poland if they were to assign their own jets to Ukraine, which Ukraine is asking for. The US says it stands ready to provide them if Poland is willing to actually send them across, but it's a decision for Poland as a sovereign nation about whether or not they're willing to send their Soviet-made jets to Ukraine, and obviously the risk that takes in potentially Russia then targeting Poland.
Well, speaking of neighbouring countries, the US is trying to calm fears among some of the other countries in the region that they could well be next in Russia's plan to perhaps redraw the boundaries of Europe.
So we have the Secretary of State from the U.S.
And there you have it, folks. Now, sound recorded on my end and then played through your speakers are not the best depiction of audio quality. Hence my review here. Bass on this thing is deep and strong, most likely more than any other large-sized Bluetooth speaker that I've tested, and that includes the now recalled Beats Pill XL. There are times, however, where there is slight spillover of bass, but I'm certain bass heads wouldn't mind at all. For the average consumer, most would still appreciate the sound, as the bass
bass isn't droning or muddled, and if there is any spillover to the mid-range, this is minimal at times and happens only once in a while on certain bass-heavy songs. As for the mid-range, this does well in offering a more neutral soundstage. Voices still comes across clear enough and can be appreciated by most, and when comparing to the Extreme, I do personally prefer the JBL's brighter sound signature, as vocals are much more distinct, pushed forward, and interpreted as clear. With the Fugu XL, if and only when you do put these side by side and perform a test like I did here, you can hear the Fugu sound a bit more recessed. However, if you were to test and play this without a comparison, most average consumers would very much appreciate the overall sound. The difference is there, but it's not a deal breaker by any means. And regarding the high notes, the Fugu keeps within reason without overreaching and becoming ear-ringing or ear-tinging. Overall, the definition and clarity performs similar to most other Bluetooth speakers, including the JBL Extreme, meaning this isn't up to the Bose SoundLink 3 standard, which I'll admit is not easy to beat for a Bluetooth speaker. Now, when comparing overall loudness, both the Fugu and the JBL can offer sound for large rooms, and they sound almost equivalent when you're standing at moderate distances. Now, when you're standing closer to one of these speakers, it does seem that the JBL is louder, most likely due to the more forward mid-range. And last, regarding Bluetooth signal, I was able to walk to the other side of my house here and downstairs with no issues, having the signal go through several walls and of course the first floor ceiling. Overall, this is a great speaker if you do value its protective casing and waterproofing features, and where the Fugu XL shines is how loud and how bassy this can get while not distorting or becoming raspy or droning. Aside from the lack of an easier to read battery indicator, the lack of including in the package a carrying strap like the JBL Extreme, this speaker comes highly recommended. Let me know what you think down below. Do you prefer the Fugu or do you like the JBL Extreme that much better? So I hope this review helped you in some way. Be sure to add me onto Facebook, Twitter, and or Instagram, and if you haven't already, be sure to like and follow my channel. I'm Jimmy with Jim's Review Room, and my channel is here to help you make a purchase decision. You guys take care. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Taxpayers up to $2.5 billion and not $1 billion of the state's economic growth, according to the Treasurer Cameron Dick. As the Insurance Council of Australia said, the flooding in southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales has resulted in $1 billion in claims so far. Mr. Dick says the natural disaster would cost billions to rebuild key infrastructure, including roads
as of this video, as I'm writing this or speaking to the camera right now, I'll put up the screenshots. It's going for about $150 as well as $130 from reputable resources like Amazon and such.
Glenn, the first cricket test between Australia and Pakistan in Rawalpindi is heading for a draw as the Tourists reach 7 for 449. Their first innings at Stumps on day 4, still trailing the host.
So anyways, guys, I'm Jimmy with Jim's Review, and I'm here to help you make that purchase decision. Welcome, everyone,
century caught in
to
slips
the review.
490. Steve Smith was out late in the day as well.
Going over the physical features, this thing looks damn sleek. It looks really modern, contemporary. It's all black, very Jim's Review Room-ish style. You got your front fabric grill, very premium built here. There's no compromise, no speakers being exposed where you mess up. Rotating to the rear, we have hard plastic on the back with a silicone rubberized textured band going all the way around the speaker. It's really grabby. You do feel this little grippy texture. I do wish it was all the way around here as well to continue that premium feel. You don't get that. But going over the buttons real quick, if you're looking at the front and on like I am, you got your Bluetooth pairing button on your left. You have your JBL Connect Plus feature. It's the same logo practically because they're basically they own each other with the same company, Carbon Card and JBL. But I did test this and try to pair it with my JBL Pulse 3 speaker, which is on the shelf right over there, and also some other JBL speakers I have here in the office. Unfortunately, you couldn't get them to pair together and play in stereo mode. Now, you can use another Harman Kardon product that has the JBL or Harman Kardon Connect Plus feature and have them play both at the same time or connect up to 100 plus speakers and have those all play at the same time if you have a bunch around you. Now, moving on here with the buttons, we have audio down, audio up, and we do have the phone call button, and on the right, we have the Australian feature. Now, rotating to the rear, this speaker is about 4.5 pounds. It does come with this little handle. This speaker is meant to be more stationary to stay at home like so, but what I'm trying to say is because of the handle, it does make carrying a little bit easier. If you need to bring this to a friend's house, if you need to bring it downstairs, it's not a big deal to be honest with you. It's no different than carrying one of these around. This is the Sony XB40.
I think it was unfair, to be honest with you. I think it was a shame. The Perth Lynx have beaten the Adelaide Lightning 104 points to 79 to record the first Women's National Basketball League.
So this one basically sits right in between.
months.
It's a minute difference. What I'm saying is that, yes, all these speakers are portable, including the Onyx 4 right here. It does have a little bit of weight, so of course throwing this bag might not be ideal. Especially, and I just want to point this out to you as well, these legs does not
have defeated the New Zealand Breakers
movable.
92-74
I thought they were
in Hobart in their National Basketball League clash.
Indentation here.
Opened up a
But
lead
again,
in the
this
third
stays
quarter,
here
led by
to
Jason
keep the
Kadee, who
speed
recorded 22 points.
Now,
and Robert
looking at this
Franks,
here, this
who
is
had
a
23
passive
points
radiator.
to go
This does
with
flex pretty
10
well. Looks really
rebounds.
cool when you
Bullets
got
coach
music
James
going.
Duncan
And then
says it was a
rotating all the
breakthrough
way to the
victory.
bottom, you have a micro USB port for service. You have a 3.5mm input for physical connections, and you do have a power port here, which connects to the supplied wall adapter. This is not charged by micro USB. Now, Better Life is claimed to be up to 8 hours, an improvement over the Onyx race, only claimed up to 5 hours. But did I get 8 hours on this one? I tested this just like all my Bluetooth speakers at 50% volume. I did this several times here. I'm getting around 6 hours and 20 minutes on average, not close to the 8 hours, but again, to the previous generations, it still does well. Compared to these, this does like crap, to be honest with you. But again, like I said, it does come with a wall mount. This is meant to be more of a at-home stationary speaker. So other than that, missing features I've noticed on here was NFC. There's no near-field communication, no easy pairing. That is, it's not waterproof, water resistant. It's not durability, or not drop resistant. That is, we don't have battery indicators, which I implore every Bluetooth speaker to have, every manufacturer to implement on here. There's no voice prompts either, so I don't know when it's in pairing mode. And we do have capabilities with Siri and Google Assistant, which is a plus by holding down one of the buttons here. Other than that, that's really about it in regards to overall features. Last but not least, before I forget here, Bluetooth 4.2 is featured on the speaker. I did test this with my iPhone 10 and Samsung S8 Plus, and we're able to get 83 linear feet of this speaker sitting in the back shelf over there, and we walked out into the hallway, and that's the signal going through about 2 walls or so. Again, 83 linear feet of
Eastern Daylight Time, 6:30 in South Australia.
Now, moving on to the audio performance, please put on your headphones and earphones. We're going to be using binaural microphones, which gives you this 3D experience. Please put on your headphones and earphones on record. That's the only way that you're going to really hear this. I'll give you my verdict, my assessment of the audio performance afterwards. Here it goes. And that's it for the Bluetooth signal. It did very well.
ABC News with Anna Pikett. Good morning. Starting in New South Wales, and authorities have issued more than a dozen flood evacuation orders overnight as intense weather hit Sydney. Kathleen Ferguson reports.
The latest flood evacuation order has been issued for East Hills early this morning, with properties bound by Henry Lawson Drive, the railway, Georges River and the East Hills footbridge. Residents on Carinya Road in Picnic Point have been instructed to leave by 9 o'clock this morning. Evacuation orders were also issued for East Hills, the northern side of Riverview Road at Pleasure Point, St George's Crescent at Sandy Point, Deepwater Park at Milpera, parts of George's Hall, Chipping Norton, Landsvale and Holsworthy, and Warwick Farm Racecourse. Parts of Moorebank and the western side of Epsom Road between Westbury Street and Childs Road have also been ordered to leave. Residents and businesses in parts of Camden were also told to leave.
Meanwhile, 2 people are missing after their car was found in a stormwater canal at Wentworthville in Sydney's west. The car was found in the Cooper Creek Canal yesterday afternoon. Police are searching for the vehicle's owner, a 67-year-old woman, and her 34-year-old son. The body of a missing man has been found in floodwaters southwest of Brisbane. The 31-year-old and his vehicle were discovered by police divers in the Condamine River in Warwick around 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Police say the man had been missing for more than a week. It takes the death toll from the Queensland flood disaster to 13. Federal Labor says more needs to be done to plan for future disasters, including what role the Australian Defence Force should play. Around 2,000 ADF personnel have been deployed to help with the floods. Locals have criticised the speed of the response. Shadow Defence Minister Brendan O'Connor says there are insufficient resources for emergency services, and there's serious discussion the role of ADF needs to be had.
Either we dedicate resources to agencies that should be tasked with dealing with emergencies, and the ADF be used sparingly in that regard, or we resource the ADF more and train them up.
Meanwhile, the Insurance Council of Australia says increasing rates of natural disasters are set to increase the push-up cost of policies. CEO Andrew Hall says some insurers will no longer cover houses and businesses that are known to flood. He's calling for greater investment into disaster proofing.
What we've got to think about moving forward is that it's not just
I wish there was a little bit more detail. It went up a little bit higher, a little bit more resolution of very high end for simul crashes, simulators, and such. Rock music, it does good, but again, you do lose that
if we want to keep downward pressure on previous.
In other news, the US believes Russia has now committed nearly 100% of the forces it has amassed around Ukraine's borders to the conflict. As North America correspondent Carrington Clark.
A senior defense official says there is no indication Russia is preparing to move additional forces from elsewhere in the country to shore up what it has already utilized. The United States is sending 500 more of its troops to Europe to support its NATO allies. The extra troops mean there will soon be roughly 100,000 US military personnel stationed in Europe. The US says it stands ready to provide American-made jets to Poland if Poland were to send Soviet-made jets to Ukraine. Poland has not yet indicated it would be willing to make the trade. Carrington Clark, ABC News, Washington.
The UK, Canada and the Netherlands have announced a coalition to provide long-term support for Ukrainians. Boris Johnson has pledged more than $313 million of contributions to the embattled nation. Canada's PM Justin Trudeau has announced further sanctions against Russian oligarchs, while Mr Johnson is encouraging members of the international community to join the trilateral commitment.
This is the moment for Ukraine's friends to create a coalition of humanitarian, economic and defensive military support to ensure that Putin
please subscribe if you haven't already and follow me on social
Data
media
shows that official global death toll from COVID-19 has surpassed 6 million. Research from Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Centre notes the real figure is likely to be even higher. And the family of Shane Warne has shared their grief over the sudden loss of the cricketing great as he makes his final journey back home to Australia later today. In a statement, his parents, 3 children, brother and ex-wife paid tribute to their loved one, saying he was the best dad and mate they could have asked for. Thai authorities have also confirmed Warne died of a heart attack. You are listening to the latest from ABC News.
Think of when somebody mentions Bluetooth speakers. With their new
the US has tried to calm fears among its Baltic allies, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, that they could be next in Russia's plan to redraw the boundaries of Europe. Correspondent Ann Barker reports.
The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on a visit to the 3 Baltic allies, which, like Ukraine, are former Soviet states and increasingly uneasy about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what it could mean for their own sovereignty. Latvia has called for a permanent presence there of US troops. Lithuania has warned Russia's aggression could lead to a Third World War. The Secretary of State assured both countries of American support and NATO protection. He says the US commitment to NATO's Mutual Defense Pact is sacrosanct and that NATO and the US are discussing a permanent basing of troops in the Baltic countries.
Pretty much the same thing.
Home, in a digital learning company linked to the federal government's $27 million early language program, is facing 48 child employment charges. Josie Taylor reports.
The Victorian Wages Inspectorate has filed 48 charges against company Millipede in the Melbourne Magistrates Court. The charges relate to the employment of 23 children aged under 15 in 2021. The ABC understands some of the children were involved with the digital early learning language program called Ella, which is funded by the federal government and used in thousands of preschools. It's alleged the company failed to obtain permits which allows the inspectorate to supervise the employment of children.
Environmentalists have slammed new federal government funding for exploratory fracking in the Northern Territory's Beetaloo Basin as irresponsible. Pending regulatory approvals, gas company Sweep Petroleum will be awarded a $7.5 million grant. Kirsty Howie from the Environment Centre NT says the risks involved in fracking the Beetaloo are too great.
testing the range, I easily played music from about 30 feet away. Further than that, I started to get occasional dropouts and skips. If you want to plug your music in instead, just tap the aux button on top. Like the similarly priced Bose SoundLink 3, the SRS X7
The Queen has returned to in-person royal duties, hosting Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at Windsor Castle overnight. Michelle Rimmer reports from London.
Just 2 weeks after testing positive for COVID-19, the monarch hosted the Canadian leader at her Windsor residence. Photos show the pair smiling warmly and holding hands, a move away from the social distancing measures the 95-year-old has followed since the pandemic began. Mr. Trudeau says the Queen spoke about current global events.
Perspicacious as ever, very interested in what's going on.
The two leaders posed for photos in front of a vase of blue and yellow flowers in what appears to be a gesture of support for the people of Ukraine. Michelle Rimmer, ABC News, London.
Staying in the UK, British singer Ed Sheeran has denied borrowing ideas from another artist during a copyright trial regarding one of his most successful songs. The award-winning singer is in a legal battle with grime artist Sami Chakri over the chart-topping hit Shape of You. It's alleged Mr. Sheeran ripped off parts of Mr. Chakri's song Oh Why, which was released 2 years earlier. Mr. Sheeran has told the court that allegations are untrue, saying he did not know of the grime artist's song at the time of recording his hit. Now with the morning sports news, here's Jack Snake.
The first cricket test between Australia and Pakistan in Rawalpindi is heading for a draw as the tourists reached 7 for 449 in their first innings at Stumps on day 4, still trailing the hosts by 27 runs. Marnus Labuschagne was caught in slips for 90 and Steve Smith was out late in the day for 78, meaning each of Australia's top 4 batters reached 50 but none have scored a century. Smith says losing his wicket was frustrating.
Disappointed in shot selection and really just the position of the game as well. If we perhaps gone in 5 down, we might have been able to push a little bit harder in the morning and potentially set something up.
Australia will also play Pakistan in the Women's World Cup in New Zealand today. The Perth Lynx have beaten the Adelaide Lightning 104 points to 79 to record their first Women's National Basketball League home win in 26 months and go top of the ladder. And Brazilian surfer Tatiana Weston Webb has won the World Surf League event in Portugal after Australian Stephanie Gilmore was knocked out in the semi-finals.
Turning to finance news, and global markets are sharply lower as the Ukraine war pushes the price of crude oil higher. Brent crude is trading at $125 a barrel after surging to a close of $140 earlier in the session. The outlook for an oil price shock could soon take Australian petrol prices to above $2.15 a litre. The Australian share market is set to open 0.1% higher later this morning, and the Australian dollar is lower, trading at 73.2 US cents. ABC News.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
Good to have you with us this Tuesday. Good morning, I'm Glenn Bartholomew, and coming up on the program this morning...
We've had a massive amount of rain that has fallen in an already saturated and previously flooded catchment.
The SES door knocked Sydney homes overnight, telling people to leave flood-prone areas immediately. And also...
In the 12 days since Russia launched this illegal and brutal assault, the world has come together in solidarity with the indomitable people of Ukraine.
Countries continue to unite in support of Ukraine. The latest coalition news coming your way shortly. Heavy rain continuing in Sydney, windy conditions as well. Possible showers in Brisbane and Canberra, and possibly a shower or storm in Darwin today. But let's start in New South Wales. Authorities have issued more than a dozen flood evacuation orders overnight as intense weather hits Sydney. Overnight, the State Emergency Service issued evacuation orders for a swathe of suburbs across the city's southwest after a big cell dumped a huge amount of rain over that region. 2 people are missing this morning after their car was found in a stormwater canal at Wentworthville in Sydney's west. Phil Campbell from the State Emergency Service says crews are dealing with very challenging conditions at the moment.
There was some very heavy rain yesterday, lots of flash flooding around, which kept our crews very busy, right up and down the Sydney Metro and further afield. But today we're going to see that continuation of heavy rain, and unfortunately those rivers continuing to rise out on the Hawkesbury, and it looks like it'll be somewhat worse than last week and very similar to last year.
And so we could have damaging winds coming through. Do we have a lot of reports of trees down already, of landslides and this kind of thing?
Look, in terms of trees, not yet. The wind observations still aren't too bad, only about 20 or 30 k's, but the Bureau's telling us that as this east coast low tracks in towards the Sydney Metro, we are going to see these winds potentially get up to around 90 kilometres an hour. And given just how saturated the soils are, we're really concerned lots of trees and branches are going to come down, and that's just going to add to the difficulties for commuters who are going to find heavy rain as well as potentially debris on the road as well.
And that heavy rain fell in the west, the south, Bowral, Billabong, these sort of areas, but there's more heavy rain to come today.
That's right. The Bureau is saying potential for a good 100 mils widespread again today across much of the city metropolitan and unfortunately into the Warragamba catchment as well. So those people out in Western Sydney will...
Guys, I know what this compartment's for. I just figured it out. Check it out.
And we've been working very hard overnight around Camden and other areas.
You know what that is?
Sydney.
For the best for the kids I used to.
Overnight?
How you doing? You may be wondering where I've been this past little while. Well, as a matter of fact, I was laid out in traction. I took a serious blow to the head. But I'm okay now. My memory's starting to come back. We have before us today for use this product right here. It's called the Marley Bluetooth No Bounce Sport. It's a speaker. You can connect it to your phone, your computer, probably your watch, whatever the kids are doing these days. Oh, let's take a look at this packaging over here, right?
Many others,
I like this packaging. I don't know about you.
Sandy Point,
I think it looks pretty good.
Georges Hall, Chipping Norton,
the thing that's kind of confusing me a little bit, though, is it says here Marley. And when I see that name Marley, I think about Bob Marley from the reggae jazz. I don't know why you call a speaker called Marley. It's kind of conflicting for me right now. I'm not sure what that's about. We're going to investigate. Look at this beautiful design, folks. They have this kind of like a natural appeal. That's why I decided to film on this wooden table. I hope you could appreciate that. Box is pretty heavy. It's got lots of good design elements here. As you can see, they did a lot of typography study. Unlike me, I dropped out of school after grade 3. Oh, down here says Bob Marley. My suspicions were correct. What does Bob Marley have to do with the Bluetooth speaker? I'm a little confused at this point in time. Let's read what it says about this thing, this product right here, right? Let's try to get our bearings. Bluetooth. Yeah, we got that. No bounce sport. Portable Bluetooth audio system. Okay. Regrind cork. Rewind fabric. 12-hour playtime. That's important. It's water and dust proof. I don't know what that means, proof. Maybe if it gets caught in the rain, it's not going to instantly fry. All right. That'll be good, I guess. I don't know. 360 degrees of sound, it says. That's kind of interesting. You pop it on the table, everybody's going to hear it. Whether they want to or not. Everybody's going to hear it. Kind of like my neighbors. Rotary volume control, water dust proof, and waterproof stash compartment. I don't know what that means, folks. But I'm just excited to check this product out. So why don't we start off right off the bat and get this thing open, right? Oh, wait a minute. I see there's a little lever here. Oh, it's magnetized.
Well, we have been concerned.
Oh, give this video a like if you like magnets.
And we do have flood.
That's magnetized right there, folks. All right, let's get my knife out of the way.
And we have been getting
look at that crazy design, man. It's on a corner. It's on a corner. You gotta look at this on a corner kind of a thing.
To put your home on.
Here we have a nice, beautiful product shot of this thing laying in amongst leaves. It's kind of like a salad. Like somebody made a salad, and at the last minute, pow, they put down the speaker. I don't know. I want to open this thing. I want to take a look at the product.
Difference, and of course, as we've seen, the water levels dropping
this open here, folks.
Then the next level
Pop this, lift that,
and it's progressively come down.
ZOG unboxing videos, folks. Nothing but the best. Make sure you